Well, welcome. My name is Jeff Kronschnabel. It says in the program that I'm David Clement, but he's younger, better looking, and a lot smarter, so you'll see him in a little bit, David. So I'd like to say to you that my name is Jeff Kronschnabel. I'm the instructor in charge for public policy administration here at St. Petersburg College. Our students are well-versed in public policy. We don't get into public policy ideologies. We talk about how to identify an issue and come up with a recommendation for resolution of that issue. Tonight, we're going to have the opportunity to do just that in a real-life, real-time, involving real people situation. So we're honored and fortunate tonight to have a distinguished panel here to address a very important topic of Florida criminal justice in 2019 and beyond. The project on accountable justice began back in 2012. They started as a data collection think tank trying to make a difference in the criminal justice system. And after 6 forums and 8 years, here we are. I would tell you, these people are phenomenal. They come from diverse backgrounds. They come from different political ideologies. But the key difference in what these folks do is they recognize an issue, they come together, they work together, and they get resolution to the issue. Some of the best accomplishments that they've done is that they've been the driving force behind civil citations, which allows a first offender a second chance, a nonviolent first offender. They're also behind the diversion programs, both in Pinellas County and Pasco County. So let me talk to a little bit more here. St. Petersburg College. So we're honored to be part of this program, Project on Accountable Justice. They sent me up there to Tallahassee in 2012, and I met these folks. And I wasn't sure what I was doing there, because my history is, and the chief's here from Dallas Parks, the chief, I had 28 years as a police officer for Clearwater. My job was to put people into the program that they were talking about getting people out of. But after a few minutes, I realized the intent, the passion, and the reasons, and I was all in. So when we look at this a little further, we're a member of 28 community colleges in the state of Florida. We have 40,000 plus students, 8 campuses. And we don't take second best from any of those other colleges. We have baccalaureate programs. We have something like, I think, 18 baccalaureate programs now, of which public policy is one of those. I think if you'd like to sit in on one of our classes, not enroll, but just sit in, you're more than welcome to come. You can get online, get a schedule, give me a little email, and we'll set that up so you can come by and see how your students are doing, see how your instructors are doing. One of the city managers here in Pinellas County said to me one time at a ball game, and it made all the difference in the world. He said, "Do you know that when your students come to us, that they're job ready?" And I said, "Well, that's what they're supposed to be." He says, "That's not what we get normally." So tonight, these folks from Project on Accountable Justice and this distinguished panel is job ready. We have some distinguished people in the audience. I have County Commissioner Kathleen Peters. She's in the back. Kathleen, hey, welcome, thank you. And we have our panel, but I'm going to go ahead and turn this over to our distinguished chairman of Project on Accountable Justice, Richard Duran, to lead us through the next few steps. But thank you and nice to have you here tonight.
Thank you, Jeff, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm Richard Doran, and as Jeff mentioned, I have the great honor to be the chair of the executive board of the Project on Accountable Justice, of which I am a founding member. PAJ, as we like to call ourselves, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan criminal justice think tank administratively housed at Florida State University's School of Social Sciences and Public Policy. But it's a collaborative effort between Florida State, Tallahassee Community College, and our host tonight, St. Petersburg College. I think we are the only think tank devoted exclusively to the study of criminal justice in the state of Florida, and we're very proud of that unique placement. The mission of PAJ is to advance public safety through evidence-based practices and policies. PAJ is committed to an approach wherein all policy deliberations that impact criminal justice at the local and the state level are driven by research that is independent and dispassionate. A recent example of our work is a report entitled Florida's Criminal Justice Reform, Understanding the Challenges and Opportunities. This report, which was issued in 2017 and which will be updated later this year, shows who is going to prison in our state, why they are going to prison, and for how long. It also reveals disparities that suggest how the justice system treats you in Florida may depend more on where you live and what you look like than what crime you committed. The report concludes with suggested opportunities for reform that may lead to enhanced public safety and reduction in the billions of taxpayer dollars spent every year to run the Florida prison system. In addition to our research, PAJ regularly hosts events such as this one. In fact, I believe this is our 6th event here at St. Pete College. Past events have focused on how states such as Texas and Georgia reduced prison populations while saving taxpayers millions of dollars, on how bail reform is being addressed in various jurisdictions around the country, and a year-end review presentation regarding actions undertaken by the Florida Legislature and relevant state agencies. We think we have another exciting program for you all tonight, and we hope that you will find it as engaging as we do. We thank you so much for joining us, and without further ado, I'd like to introduce the Executive Director of the Project on Accountable Justice and the person that really makes this all work. She is the engine behind so much of the reform effort in our state, and we are very, very blessed as a board to have her as the Executive Director, Ms. Deborah Brodsky. Deborah?
I have absolutely the most fantastic board, and I would be remiss by not pointing out that David Clement and Jeff Kronschnabel are both members of our executive committee, as is General Doran, my chairman, and they are wonderful people, deeply, deeply dedicated to improving and modernizing Florida's criminal justice systems. It is my absolute honor to be able to introduce our first speaker, whose bio is in the program, as are all the bios of most of us up here. For reasons I don't think I need to introduce from his bio, I just want to talk a little bit personally about the experience of watching what I call a real champion emerge in our Florida legislature. Senator Jeff Brandes. This is a personal story. I sit in committee hearings often with some of my colleagues who are going to speak with us later and watch deliberations. I have been doing this for many, many years. And I was sitting in a committee meeting when Senator Brandes joined the Criminal Justice Committee in the Senate. And I have a fan base. It's a fan base of one. And any guesses as to what that might be? Who that might be? It's my mom, who happens to live in Canada, but loves what we're doing and how we're working on things in Florida. She finds Florida fascinating for so many reasons, but certainly the criminal justice system and its dysfunction in particular are very attractive to her as a spectator sport. And she was watching a committee hearing, and she sent me an email. And of course, you're sitting there in the committee trying to behave yourself, and the email says, "Who is that guy? That Brandes guy is fantastic." And she said, "Call me later." So I called her later, and she was like, "That's the champion. It's a champion you all have been talking about." And I am so thrilled to be able to introduce him here for you today. He's from here. So this is his home, but talk about a statesman. This is a person who I think really for the first time we've seen a visionary leader who can imagine a way forward. And what that means to us is to really view things holistically and not just simply whack in what we call whack-a-mole, like see a problem, smack it. He has the kind of brain and mind and vision that ensures that we're looking at all the pieces and being very pragmatic about it. It's my absolute pleasure to introduce Senator Jeff Brandes.
So I got put on the Criminal Justice Committee back in, I think, 2014 or 15, and we're going through one of our first criminal justice committees, and there's just 5 of us. It's a really intimate setting. There's only 5 members of this committee, and it was my first time ever sitting on a committee. I'm not an attorney by trade. I'm a Christian, and so I had no real criminal justice background. I had been in the military for a few years. For 11 years, I served in Iraq in 2003, 2004 with the 101st. Thank you. And this was my first kind of foray into the world of criminal justice. And we're 2 committee weeks in, and we're talking about people that had been injured in prison and inmates that had some type of injury to them. And the Secretary of the Department of Corrections stands up, and she begins to tell us this story about an inmate in South Florida who was locked in the shower by the guards. They turned the shower all the way up, and they left him there for 2 hours. And amidst his screams that eventually fell silent, he died. And I remember this. It just hit me. As I looked around this committee, I saw my other members of the committee. Some were on their phone. Some were kind of thinking about other things, working on their computer. And I had this visceral reaction that I was on a plane at 30,000 feet with an engine out and upside down and probably nobody at the controls. And so that is what has led me to begin to work on criminal justice, because I realized that somebody of the 160 members of the Florida Legislature had to race forward to take on the controls of this plane that's upside down with an engine out and likely going to crash. And so we began the journey of thinking about and looking at the criminal justice system. And I can tell you, I can report to you today that it isn't much better than where I started a few years ago. But we know where the runway is. That's step one. We know who we want to put, we know who needs to fly it. We think we can begin to turn the ship this year because we have a new governor. And I can tell you that all the other passengers, or many of the other passengers on this plane, also realize that we're flying upside down with an engine out and also want to be helpful at the controls. So that's step one. So we have about 96,000 people incarcerated in Florida's prison system today. And while crime rate has fallen in Florida, and that's very, very positive, and less people are actually going into prison, that's incredibly positive. Because of the length of stay for many individuals, we see the prison population being very, very stable inside the prison population. One of the biggest challenges we have inside of our prisons right now is just hiring guards. We are somewhere between 1,500 and 2,000 guards short inside the Department of Corrections today. A few years back, we switched from 8-hour shifts because of this problem of guards to 12-hour shifts. But because we're so many guards short, it's often the case that guards will be held over. So imagine you've worked a 12-hour day, your boss calls up and says, look, we need you to work another 4 hours. So now you've worked 16 hours. This happens day after day after day, and while the pressure is on the wardens for less overtime, right? The simple truth is people have to have, there's posts that have to have guards at them. So, and what we can see is many of the challenges that we have inside the prison system today are really symptoms of a lack of guards. And a lack of guards for a number of reasons. One, our prisons are largely located in very rural areas. These were jobs programs. Many of them were built under the age of Reuben Askew, and they haven't been upgraded. They haven't been updated in many, many years. Many of our prison facilities are not air conditioned. And so, and for the most part, our guards are live in and come from that community, and it's really hard because, as we've seen, people there's kind of this rural to urban flight going on, and so your talented workers from many of your rural areas are moving to your more urbanized areas, and that's creating just a population problem of finding talented individuals who want to be prison guards. The second problem we have is it pays virtually nothing, right? The average prison guard comes in, probably makes, somewhere between $32,000 to $36,000 a year starting salary, and so they're subsidizing their income in other ways, whether it's a second job or some other way, they're subsidizing their income. So that creates challenges. And frankly, in most of our rural counties where these prisons are located, our sheriffs are looking for talent too. And who better to hire than somebody with already a year of training? And so oftentimes the sheriffs will go in, they'll look at the amount of the people that are current guards or corrections officers, and they'll offer them a $10,000 signing bonus, an extra $5,000 a year. They get to keep their same benefits. And so this is really an advancement. And so if you go into a prison today, the average prison guard will have between 1 and 2 years of experience. And so you have tired, worn out, largely overworked individuals with virtually no experience behind bars, guarding a prison population, and we're radically understaffed. And that is the situation that we find ourselves today. If you went into an educational institution, if you go into one of the education institutions on the prisons, what you will hear is we have lots of programs. We have all kinds of programs. Let me tell you about our programs. And then when you say, well, great, how many teachers do you have? You go, oh, we got one. Well, most of these facilities have between 1,200 and 1,500 inmates. So you have 1,500 inmates and one teacher. And you can blame them. The teachers outside in the county, they're making $40,000, $50,000 a year. The teachers inside working the Department of Corrections are making $30,000. And so are we surprised that there's no educators inside the Department of Corrections? We go to the medical facilities, and medical facilities, they pull us aside and they say, please help us. We need more nurses. We need more individuals to help in this facility. When you talk to the wardens, they tell you about the maintenance issues that they have. I was down in Charlotte Correctional 2 weeks ago, and the warden says, look, we've been cited by the county health department 3 times for the freezer that we have. It's old. It's been here 30 years. We need a new freezer. It's going to cost us $15,000. I don't have $15,000 to put into a freezer system, so we have the old freezer. That's just one example of one of the challenges that we're seeing inside the Department of Corrections in just one facility. But I can tell you, I haven't been to a facility that had a full complement of teachers yet. Our chaplains are now often part-time librarians because we're not able to sustain a full-time chaplain. And so I tell you that we have 96,000 inmates, and believing that something has to change, clearly. And one of my favorite sayings in politics, Ben Stein's dad, many of you know who Ben Stein is, but his dad, his name was Herb Stein. He came up with what is one of my favorite sayings, and that is that things that are unsustainable tend to stop. It's called Stein's Law. Trends that can't continue won't. And I will tell you that the prison system as it stands in Florida today is completely unsustainable. We have moved away and are no longer correcting anyone. We are largely warehousing. And so the question is, how do we move from a Department of Corrections, from a Department of Warehousing to a Department of Corrections? And I think that's what I hope we're going to discuss tonight, some of the ideas, the vision that it's going to take, the leadership that it's going to take, frankly, the passion that it's going to take this issue and move it from the Department of Warehousing to the Department of Corrections. Everything in Tallahassee needs 2 things to be successful. Everything needs a vision, and it needs a champion. The Department of Corrections, and largely corrections in Florida in general for the last 20 years, has had very little vision. And I can tell you there's been almost no champions. And that is why we find ourselves where we are today. When there are issues as big, as important as the area of justice, and no legislators, leaders step up and take the entire issue on, and it is left to meander through the halls of Tallahassee, what you get is an area of policy that drifts into the rocks, and that's where we are. But I'm excited because I think there is a pathway out. I think we're going to talk about tonight some discussion about diversion, because I think the first thing you have to do is recognize how many inmates can we actually afford to have. And let's just say, for the sake of argument, that instead of 96,000 inmates, that we could afford and effectively say that we have a Department of Corrections if we had 86,000 inmates. what would be the pathway to get from 96,000 inmates to 86,000 inmates? And that's one of the questions I think we're going to talk about tonight. That includes diversion. We have to divert on the front end. It includes transition. We have to transition people out on the back end. We have about 23% of our inmates that are over the age of 50. We would consider those as people that might be eligible for transitioning out or out of prison. We have a whole cadre of low-risk individuals inside of prison. And so how do we think about diverting those individuals or giving them another pathway out? How do we transition people into halfway houses so that we have the opportunity to place them on the outside? So those are some of the things we're going to discuss tonight that I'm excited about, and look forward to answering your questions as we go forward. So with that, thank you so much.
There we go. So I'm just asking my friends to come sit up here. And like I mentioned before, I'm not going to read bios, but just know that I have spent many hours sitting in those same committee meetings rooms with the gentleman on the far end of the table, Greg Newbern from Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and I've just been delighted to get to know Neil Volz a little bit more. And we're going to celebrate a little bit of success in the state of Florida and talk about a couple of wins, most recent wins in constitutional amendments shortly. But I want to start first by talking a little bit with Senator Brandis about one of the, I think, key sort of priorities of our organization, the Project on Accountable Justice, which means we want accountability. We want to know that our taxpayer money is being used wisely and is being measured, and that whatever we're investing in is actually resulting in better public safety outcomes. One of the things that we've noticed is a lack of accountability in the Department of Corrections, and in particular in monitoring and oversight functions. And I see them in two lines. One is sort of this general idea of do we have one entity in the state of Florida who's actually looking at a blueprint or a plan for criminal justice at large? And I don't mean the Department of Corrections. I mean really taking a look at the entire system, from everything from what's going on at our county levels to what's going on in reentry to what's going on in the Department of Juvenile Justice, a feeder, all too often, a feeder system into our Department of Corrections. And a couple of ways I think that these have been longstanding recommendations of our organization. One is to create a body that serves as sort of a board of trustees in the same way that our board of trustees serves over to govern my organization, reviewing all the financials, being there to support us, advocating on behalf of us, and really being able to proactively address problems rather than respond to them. A couple of years ago, we've had several versions of different pieces of legislation that have suggested, and I think you were author of one of them, that included, which I found absolutely marvelously fascinating, first time I think nationally, a statewide commission that also had a formerly incarcerated person as designated member of that commission. I think that is imperative. So can you talk a little bit about what governance is lacking, or any vision for governance going forward?
So I agree. I think largely these criminal justice committees come in place and they have a 2-year chairmanship, and the challenge you have. I mean, term limits. I'm a fan of term limits. I'm not a fan of term limits for chairmanships that are 2 years, because I think what you have is I've jumped from transportation to transportation appropriations to criminal justice in the span of 6 years, and while my passion right now is criminal justice, it's hard to kind of have this consistent vision if every 2 years you have a schizophrenic chairman who's jumping around into different areas of policy, working on other things. And I think that's just the structure of the Florida system. And I think, to your point, there needs to be a group out there that has the authority to go into these prisons, that's providing us insight and counsel throughout our term. But I think part of it is we need a consistent chairman of committees that have a more than a 2-year lifespan, because I think that it just takes 2 years to learn what's going on inside the Department of Corrections, and if you're moving on, That's one of the bigger challenges I think we face.
And in terms of education, so I don't know exactly how many new members we have in the Florida Legislature, but somewhere 40, 50 new members, I would guess. These folks don't know anything, and probably most of them have, about criminal justice, excuse me. I'm sure they know lots of things. They don't know anything walking into some of these substantive committees and policy areas because they come from other backgrounds, which is why we have a citizen legislature. It's a great concept, but then when you actually have to put the rubber where the road, it gets more complicated. The visiting, we have a statute, 944.23, which allows any sitting legislator, a public defender, a judge, and members of the Florida Commission on Offender Review to walk into any prison at any moment now. And I know and have admired the legislators who have taken that on. You in particular, certainly Senator Evers, rest in peace, started that journey for us a few years ago. But it's underused, I think. And do you have any comments on that?
I think every legislator should, within their first month of office, visit a prison and visit a juvenile justice facility.
Yep.
I think you just get a totally different perspective when you walk in and you've taken off all the metal and you've put your cell phone, you hand them your cell phone and they say, well, just keep that for you. And my dad went a few weeks ago and they made him take out one of his hearing aid batteries. You can only take one hearing aid, sir. And you go through that experience and you walk around and you talk to inmates and you talk to guards and you talk to education staff and you see the physical facilities and you realize you look at the education areas and I think you just have a very different perspective of what you thought about it being in a facility is. One of the things I recognized pretty quickly when I walked in is in every single bay, there was somebody in a walker. And that was shocking to me, that there was somebody that was I would consider elderly in prison in almost every room that I went into.
Yeah, I've had similar experience where you walk into a prison and you're seeing you may or may not have a preconceived notion of this, but the population itself, the old and graying elephant in the room is the elderly and aging population. When we talk about crisis, we have to talk about health care and the challenges we've had in funding the prison system's health care. So where are we going in terms of that? In terms of, we certainly, I'm going to start with a big one, right? Millions and millions of dollars.
Healthcare is by far the most challenging area of policy we face inside of prisons because we're under a federal consent order in many areas. Last year we allocated $40 million to mental health. For healthcare, for just mental health, and that was under a federal consent order. Another $40 million for hepatitis C. So hepatitis C is largely contrived from intravenous drug use, sharing tattoo needles, those types of things. And we have 96,000 inmates, as I told you before. Somewhere between 15% and 40% of our inmates have hepatitis C. And the average cost to treat someone with hepatitis C is between $15,000 and $25,000. And when we treat them, it's simply a treatment. It's curable. It's curable. It's a miraculous cure with this pill, but it costs $15,000 to $25,000. And we'll treat 2,000 of our 15,000 to 40,000 inmates that have Hep C this year at a cost of $40 million. And many of them will get Hep C again. I think that kind of speaks to the enormity of the challenge. And then obviously our 25% of our inmates are elderly, and for inmates, you don't qualify for Medicare or Medicaid while you're in prison. So both of those costs, all the entire healthcare costs are borne by the state in those situations. And so that creates its own set of challenges, and the legislative budget request from the Department of Corrections just for this year was $150 million for healthcare. Over and above what we spent last year. Now, if you think about this, my entire budget for all of corrections last year that I had to allocate, total money that was available for me to spend on new programs was $100 million. The Department of Corrections alone, just this year in just healthcare, has asked for $150 million. So I think that speaks to some of the fires that we're trying to deal with inside the Department of Corrections in just the healthcare space.
Well, that's a big fire, and as I mentioned before, I think we should stop now and maybe talk a little bit about some good things, and then maybe come back and revisit some of the solutions, because there is this overarching need to talk about what do we do next. But I'm going to start with Greg on the end because I can, and
I would.
So Greg is obviously from Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and I'm going to start with one question, which I just want to do just to wind you up a little bit. So mandatory minimums, the crime is down. It's like the lowest it's been in, what, 46 years, right?
47?
47 years now. And so we've had these mandatory minimums. So clearly something's working. So Greg, take it away.
Yeah. I had my blood pressure taken yesterday as part of a routine physical, and if someone had said what you just said, I probably would have been off the charts. That's what we hear all the time. If crime is down, then everything that we've chosen to do must, by definition, be right. And that is the worst sort of fallacious thinking and sophistry. Elementary logic would teach you otherwise, but that is the entire intellectual underpinning of the entire criminal justice system in the state of Florida, is whatever we have in place at the time that crime falls is by definition the only thing that can possibly cause crime to fall. A child could see through that logic and correct you, but so far we haven't been able to convince some adults of why that logic is unsound. It is absolutely true that crime is down in Florida. It's also true that it's down virtually everywhere else in the country. There is no meaningful correlation between the set of policies we've chosen to implement in Florida and the fact that our crime is down. You can go to Texas, which is also at a 47-year crime low. They have not chosen to do the sorts of things that we have chosen to do. They don't use the kind of mandatory minimum drug laws that we've had on the books for 40 years. They didn't abolish parole back in 1983 the way Florida did, and so on and so on. And it doesn't matter. You can go to other states that have chosen a different path. The result is the same. Crime is down virtually everywhere and at roughly the same rate. And you can go back even before. Crime went up in Florida and everywhere else at roughly the same rate, despite what states had chosen to do with their sentencing laws. Now, so at FAM, we focus primarily on mandatory minimum sentences. For people who don't know what those things are, they are statutory floors below which judges may not sentence certain defendants who are convicted of certain crimes. So the legislature says, if you're convicted of this crime, then the lowest sentence that you may serve is X, right? They just put it in statute, and no matter what, the judge may not sentence that defendant below that sentence. Primarily where we see this being used is in the drug world. Back in 1979, Florida passed mandatory minimum drug laws. It was the cocaine cowboys. It was violence in South Florida. And we followed New York. We followed Michigan. And we said, well, if we want to get rid of drugs, there's only one way to do it. Pass these harsh sentences. It'll scare the drug traffickers away. It'll scare people off of drugs. It'll solve the problem once and for all, and that'll be that. Well, it didn't work. It hasn't worked. We've had them on the books for 40 years. Any one of us could go out on the street and probably find cocaine in 15 minutes. We had more cocaine coming through South Florida last year and the year before than at any time in the prior 10 or 15 years before that. The price of cocaine has fallen in the last few years instead of going up, which implies that the supply is rising rather than falling, and so on. At the same time, we have put in thousands of people who are low-level, low-risk offenders who would otherwise be served better with alternative sanctions or even small jail time or treatment or rehabilitation, and instead we opt to put them in prison by the thousands. And it's a complete waste of money, it's a complete waste of lives, it ruins families, we get nothing in return for it except it costs us hundreds of millions of dollars. And it's one of the chief areas where we could meaningfully reduce the prison population at no risk to any of us. We could let these people out, save a lot of money, get them back on the straight and narrow, and we suffer no public safety cost in return. That we don't do it is madness, and there's just no explanation for it. Now, I've been at FAM since 2010. 2011 was my first legislative session, and I can tell you that back then, we didn't have a prayer. I mean, no one was talking about this. The only thing, if mandatory minimum came up in a bill search, it was to add another one, or to make another one worse, or something like that. These days, in part because of the leadership of Chairman Brandis and others like him, we're in a new world in the Florida Legislature now. We are finally getting to a point where people are listening to us and saying, yeah, well, there are some things that we can do a little bit better. There are some people in the system who don't need to be there. And once you identify those people, and we can talk a little bit about who they are and why they're there, but once you identify them, it's really a no-brainer. It's just, okay, here's where we are, what do we have to do to get there? And you know, in the last few years, I think we've taken steps toward it, but we really have to move the ball further this year and get it over the goal line for maybe the first time in a long time. But again, the conversation is shifting. Public support is critical, and once we get a critical mass of legislators and policymakers in Tallahassee to understand where we are, why we're there, and how we get out, we'll be in a much better place.
So speaking about being in a much better place, we, again, had some successes very recently, and some of our successes aren't legislative. They are actually by authority of the people, directly by the authority of the people of Florida. And so Amendment 11, I have termed the little amendment that did and will make some changes to Florida going forward if we embrace the opportunities. Could you talk a little bit about, because I gotta harp a little bit on Greg, because this was an idea that's been surfacing with folks who've been talking about criminal justice reform for many years as an absolute obstacle we were never going to overcome. And?
Yeah, so one of the worst mandatory minimums we have on the books was and is for drug trafficking and painkiller pills. This was put on the books back in 1999. And it was really for heroin, and nobody really saw the painkiller crisis coming down the road. So the way trafficking works in Florida is if you have a certain amount of a given drug, you are a trafficker, no matter what, right? You can just possess a certain amount of a drug, and you are, by definition, a trafficker. You don't have to be Pablo Escobar. You don't have to drive in a boatload of cocaine into Miami. You don't actually have to be a trafficker to be a trafficker in Florida. You can just possess a certain amount. That amount for heroin is 4 grams. It's also the amount of prescription painkillers you need to be a trafficker. However, in Florida, we weigh the entire pill, not just the controlled substance within the pill. What that means is that you can only have about 7 to 10 pills, and you are a trafficker. So anybody who's addicted to hydrocodone or oxycodone and who goes and gets a prescription, either through fraud or they buy some off the street or something, is by definition a trafficker. Okay, so fast forward, we put in many, many thousands of low-level people who are addicted to painkillers. We've called them traffickers, and we put them into prisons for 15 years, 25 years, under the pretense that they are big-time drug traffickers. Well, in 2014, the legislature did something that they very rarely do, which is to improve a mandatory minimum drug law. And they changed the threshold weights necessary to trigger the trafficking. And it was modest. It wasn't much, but it was something. So you take those very, very low-level people out of the equation. And when you did that, a bunch of people who were otherwise going to be traffickers were no longer traffickers, so there's no mandatory minimum. The problem was nobody who's actually in prison could be impacted by that. And the reason for that, this is a long-winded way of getting to the point, the reason for that is back in 1885, the people who wrote the Florida Constitution put in a little provision. It was Article 10, Section 9. They call it the Savings Clause. And what that said basically was, no matter what the legislature does, the law at the time of your offense is what governs your case forever. So even if the legislature repeals a law, or if they change it from life without parole to probation or whatever, it doesn't matter. You're on the hook for the law at the time of your offense. So in 2014, when the legislature made that change, we had a lot of people calling me saying, hey, can I get out now? And because, and in fact, the law they changed, the 25-year sentence became a 7-year sentence, and the 15-year sentence became a 3-year sentence. And we had a lot of people who had already served more time than the law requires now, and they still had a lot of time to go. We had people who had served 18 years of a 25-year sentence, and now the offense would take 7 years, right? So they'd call and say, hey, this is fantastic, we passed this law. How can you help me get out? And I'd have to say, I'm sorry, I can't, because of a provision in the Florida Constitution that was put in place in 1885. The legislature's hands are tied How's that for irony, by the way? The legislature's hands are tied now, and we can't help you. And so I said, okay, well, if it's a constitutional provision that's stopping this, we have to change the Constitution. Easy, right? Well, fam, we don't have the kind of money that you need to change the Constitution. Can't go gather signatures or anything like that. That was off the table. Well, the Constitutional Revision Commission, for all of its faults, is one vehicle to change the Constitution. So we went and said, hey, there's this old stupid law, it needs to be changed. They said, cool, let's put it on the ballot. And in November, 62% of Florida voters approved the Amendment 11 that allows now, again, for the first time since 1885, allows the legislature to go back and say, these laws are retroactive, which could potentially give relief to many, many hundreds of current prisoners and many, many thousands in the future if folks like Chair Brandis have their way and we get some of these meaningful sentencing reforms. So we were just thrilled at the idea that for the first time, we could actually get some retroactive reforms, and we think it could have a meaningful impact on the prison population.
It's rare when you have a constitutional amendment passes and election night, people are all excited about the candidates that won, and there's 5 of us that are excited about Amendment 11 passing because we just got rid of the savings clause in the state of Florida, and know what that means and how many lives that's going to impact. But it was an incredibly exciting evening, election night, for a lot of reasons, but for a few of us, Amendment 11 passing was pretty incredible.
It was an excellent and very surprising win, and we're very pleased about it. We also had another incredible win for all Floridians. I think when we talk about a system that's supposed to be, you do your time and you come out and you've paid your debt to society, yet we have so many things that we really saddle folks with that never go away. One of those things is this incredible opportunity now to really be welcomed back to Florida as a fellow citizen, and that is in Amendment 4. Neil, would you talk a little bit about your victory and the implications going forward? And really, I think there's a lot of curiosity as to, when the amendment was actually has now been implemented. The sky did not fall. The sky did not fall, did it?
The sky did not fall. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you for putting this together. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk to folks. And honestly, thanks everyone out there for showing up. Criminal justice reform is an important issue, and I think this is really valuable time. So thanks to Chairman Brandis and Greg, too. As it relates to Amendment 4, we took a little different path than Amendment 11. And it was a long time coming. It was a really special night on election night, but it was also really special just less than 10 days ago when in every county all across the state, people who had past convictions were able to go in and register to vote with their supervisor elections office, and to hear the stories of supervisors of elections themselves crying and hugging with people who had been waiting 20, 30, 40 years to have their voice heard in their community again was a pretty overwhelming experience. And maybe it's appropriate here for me to actually talk about how I got involved in the movement that helped get Amendment 4 passed. I got a felony conviction 13 years ago, so ultimately that was the catalyst for my involvement. And I got it the old-fashioned way. I earned it. I made some real stupid decisions. I crossed some lines I shouldn't have crossed. It's weird to see my biography because that's the professional success side, but the truth is I had a pretty big fall because of my own decisions and had to live with the consequences of having a felony conviction and dealing with lost employment, lost a house, got divorced, moved to Florida, and began to put the pieces of my life back together again. And again, I'm dealing with consequences that came about because of my own stupid decisions. I'm just sharing my story a little bit because one of the things that we think is really important, and not just for Amendment 4, but going forward, is to remember and to center ourselves on this conversation about what we're really talking about. That's people. That's human beings. No matter whether you're on the inside or the outside, we are talking about people and their families. One of the things that we found so empowering was knowing that, 1 million plus more people voted for Amendment 4 than any candidate, because we knew that deep down, generally speaking, people went in to go vote for their friends, their family members, their neighbors, and their loved ones. They were not voting for elected politicians or partisan politics. And I don't mean that in any disrespectful way, except for the fact that when we allow ourselves to focus on the people, we really can make a whole lot of progress. And so as it relates to my story, I'm kind of wallowing in my own junk and trying to figure out what to do with the rest of my life. And the changing point for me was I started volunteering at a homeless shelter, mainly because I couldn't get a job, and in part because I wanted to look good for the judge who still had to sentence me. And so I started step by step moving forward a little bit. And I began to see what happens when you're in a community that believes in transformation and a community that believes in second chances. I went out, I got a job, started making money because I had to pay the mortgage. And lo and behold, I got an offer to be a part-time case manager at the homeless shelter. And I decided, you know what, I should do that. Before long, I was running the homeless shelter. 10 years later, I am the chair of our homeless coalition in Lee County down near Fort Myers, helping to administer millions of dollars, taxpayer dollars, to some really awesome faith-based, secular, all kinds of organizations who just want to help people. And there would be those moments where you're like, gosh, if I have the ability to do that, why am I not able to vote? And yet I was still dealing with my own junk, right? Anybody who's made some mistakes and hurt a whole lot of people along the way, you know what that's like. And so I didn't get involved in the movement when it started. Like, this movement started about 10 years ago when a guy named Desmond Meade got a call to something bigger in his own life and realized that if the people got behind something, they could make a change to a system that wasn't working as well as it should. As it relates to me, though, it would be actually somebody else's struggle that got me involved. I was working at my church, and there's some friends of mine who we still go to church with. A friend of mine who's allowed me to share his story because he graduated from high school down in Fort Myers. And he celebrated that weekend, and he went to a McDonald's, and he was sitting at the drink dispenser. And sitting right there at the drink dispenser was one of these. And instead of grabbing it and giving it to the manager, he decided to take it home. And the cops showed up the next day, and he was in jail when his mom called me crying at midnight. Great lady, mom of 6 kids. Both her boys right now who I'm talking about are in college right now, playing basketball, living the dream. They're awesome. But in that moment, he was being force-fed a felony conviction because he broke the felony threshold for what it means to have a felony conviction in the state of Florida. And I kept talking, I talked to his mom, and please understand, like, I had changed my life. I don't take phone calls at midnight anymore, right? But that was a special moment in my life because my wife and I hung up the phone and started talking about Fred. We started talking about what it means to have a felony conviction in this state, that you instantly lose about half of your income, according to the data. I'm a person who doesn't believe that we are data. Fred's a human being, but the data does say that, and it matters what the data says. Then you start thinking about his inability to have housing. His having a felony conviction forced his parents to kick him out of his house or decide to move themselves because of where they lived. They could not live together. So that only exacerbated the situation that he was facing as somebody who was in jail right after graduation for taking a phone. Third, I began to think about in that moment, he could not vote 30, 40 years from now. It was likely. And my wife and I just got real emotional as we were talking about that experience and how close and how much we loved him and how our systems weren't working the way that they were set up to work. And the fourth part, and this is my truth, like everybody has their own reality, right? So I'm just going to be vulnerable and tell you that as an young African-American man who I love like family, a part of our conversation also included the fact that I believed that if he looked like me and lived somewhere else, he probably would be having a different experience with the criminal justice system in that moment than what he was. So that was my reality. And 3 days later, I met a guy named Desmond Meade at a local college at an event very much like this. So I mean it. Thanks for putting the time in to have something like this gather, because I think there's something special that's going on here. So fast forward into a process that led to a lot of folks like me people from all over the state who made stupid decisions or whatever their story was, sometimes things were brought onto them, began to see that there was a possibility that we could change a broken system, a system that was created in 1868, 150 years ago. And we started to get some momentum, and people started collecting petitions. When I met Desmond, it was 2015. The petition process had just begun. And without a whole lot of organization, a whole bunch of money, and all this stuff, a group of people all over the state, like regular folks, all backgrounds, all political parties, non-political parties, got together and they started collecting petitions at churches and in civic engagements in colleges, and you start to see something really cool happening. You start to see people working beyond the racial divide, beyond partisan politics, beyond socioeconomic differences. Because the truth is, and one of the things that we really felt it was important to let people know during this campaign was, who are we talking about that are impacted, right? I would go to every meeting. Desmond would go to every meeting. Other folks who are in this room, and it is so good to see you guys, people who have gotten your voice back, like, let's use it. We would go to every meeting, we would talk about it, and we talk about the value of education and knowing who it is that we were talking about. I would hold a shirt up and ask, I'm gonna tell the person who can get the closest to this following question a shirt, and I want you to tell me the honest truth. What percentage of people who have felony convictions in the state of Florida, the 1.68 million people, are African American? And it did not matter if I was at a conservative event, a liberal event, a nonpartisan event. The numbers were astounding. Most people would say 60, 70, 80%. And that wasn't the case, isn't the case. It's 30%. You know, so there needed to be an acknowledgement of real facts. So like having debates in which you're talking about data and getting facts right are very important. The other fact we would talk about is the fact that 170,000 people in the state of Florida every year get felony convictions. Normally this time I'd have my shirt up and everybody's guard was up, so they got this one more right than wrong. And say, what percentage actually get sentenced to prison? The answer is only 25% get sentenced to prison. So we're talking about people, again, people in our communities, in our pews, at work, at school with us, already living with us and working out their stuff, and they never got sentenced to prison, yet somehow they're supposed to be silenced and not have the vote for the rest of their life. So we walked through this process of getting petitions, right, and basing it around a couple basic principles. One was we want to put people first, that we want everyone in the state to know somebody in their neighborhood who this impacts. We did not want this to be about partisan politics. We did not want this to be about anything else aside from people and a basic value that we think everybody could get behind. And that was the idea that when a debt's paid, it's paid. 8 words. When a debt is paid, it's paid. We believe that's a vision that can carry us forward, too. That you start to talk about housing policy or job policy or access to employment for people who, you know, have made some mistakes or involved in the criminal justice system. We as a state stepped up and said, you know what, we believe when a debt's paid, it's paid. Maybe that's where the line should be. So long story short, right, we saw an incredible movement of people from all across the state. And they rallied behind their friends and their neighbors. And it was a vote of love. It was not a vote of hate. It was a vote of unity, and it wasn't a vote of division. And that was an amazing night on election night, to watch folks who had been discarded in their communities, you know, who had been, you know, looked at a certain way, suddenly have an extra step in their voice and having their voice back. And I always remember talking to Senator Brandis, and the thing when you have these two guys on the stages, they're brilliant. I'm hoping to touch y'all's heart because I think that this is a real issue that involves real people. But Senator Brandis said something when he was presenting, because I asked him, I'm like, hey, what is the one thing that you think we need to be able to push criminal justice reform forward? And you said, we need more people at events like this who care about criminal justice reform and are willing to call their elected officials. Well, there are 1.4 million new voters who have distinct experience with the criminal justice system, who we believe we can engage to help us move the policies that we're discussing tonight forward. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk tonight.
Thank you. And it was a wonderful night to be a Floridian, and we're all proud of, I think, whatever parts we've had in this, but thank you for all you've done. The Project on Accountable Justice is about data. We don't forget there are people behind all of the data, but we have a wonderful guest has arrived. How unexpected. This is Representative Jamie Grant. Thank you for joining us here. And I am really pleased to introduce him, not knowing that he was going to show up. This is wonderful. I was going to talk a little bit about Senator Brandes, since Neil brought it up, and he's holding his phone right there. It's an easy segue into one of those things that we would call low-hanging fruit, and that is the felony property threshold in Florida. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So a $300 theft in Florida of any, meaningful item is considered a felony. And when was that put in place? 83, 86? And in 85, it was $100, and then we raised it to $300, and it has been $300 ever since. Now most people today aren't charged with felonies. If they steal a $500 item, they get charged with a misdemeanor, but some of them are. Some of them plead to a felony. Some of them plead just to get out of the situation that they're in because somebody offered them an opportunity to plead to something and say, look, you just take this felony record, we just give the felony, and then you can, go on probation from there. And they have no clue what they're really doing when they plead to this felony. But the threshold in Florida is $300. We're the second lowest in the country as far as felony thresholds. The radical liberals of Texas are at $2,500. Georgia is at $1,500. Both of the southern states have moved their numbers up to somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500. But I think it's an area that we're starting to see some agreement on. I think last year we got to, generally amongst the House and the Senate, I think there was some agreement that we could move the felony threshold up. I think we're going to bring it back this year. I think there will be strong support to move that number up this year. We ran into some issues with the Retail Federation, frankly, the Walmart's, Publix, the organizations that they represent. They're concerned about organized retail theft, but I think we can deal with organized retail theft and still address the felony theft threshold in Florida.
That's wonderful. And since you've arrived, and I don't know that you remember a conversation we had a few years ago, and Representative Grant is the chairman of the House Criminal Justice Committee, for those of you who don't know. A couple years ago, I came to visit you, and we talked about data. And lo and behold, we have passed what I think nationally is recognized as the most robust, thanks to Senator Brandes in particular, his leadership on this with Chairman Chris Sprowls on the House side, passed what is undeniably the most robust, ambitious data collection piece across the country. I'd love to hear your take on, first of all, Senator Brandes, on what you saw as the need for such a thing, and potentially, I mean, this is kind of in your wheelhouse more generally, how we can use these data going forward to really make really thoughtful, evidence-based decisions about policy across the state.
So I think obviously the data tells a story. And we realized was we had, the Department of Corrections was great. They had data on all kinds of things, but we didn't really have data down to the judge level. We didn't understand how individual judges were sentencing. We didn't understand how sheriffs were interacting with the system. We didn't understand the diversion opportunities that were available in communities. We had a wide variety of how people were sentencing in the state. Let me give you one interesting statistic that I just found out last week. If we had the state's attorney that we had in Miami-Dade all over Florida, and the sentencing practices that we use in Miami-Dade all over Florida, instead of 96,000 inmates, I would have 56,000 inmates. If I had the state attorney that I have in Bay County all over Florida, I would have 100, and the same sentencing, they follow the same sentencing code, I would have 156,000 inmates. Right? And so I think what you're going to see after a couple of years is, as this data comes in, the story that it will tell will be pretty fascinating. The diversity of how sentences applied, same sentence, the key factor is it a rural county or is it an urban county? Do they have diversion options? Do they have no diversion options? I think you're going to see us begin to tell a more complete story about the criminal justice system in Florida.
I mean, our criminal justice system is a misnomer, right? We have 67 criminal justice systems across the state, and so this bill remarkably recognizes that is how we have to measure it. We have to get close to the unit where it matters, and that is in our communities. Representative Grant, I would love to hear, we're talking vision, we're talking future for Florida, criminal justice. You've walked in, we're all really excited about what that means. The House has historically been a little bit more challenging than the Senate.
That's a fact on this issue.
That's rarely ever said.
I was about to say, it's only true on this issue. No, it's, look, I think good news and bad news. I think the good news is we absolutely passed the framework for what is the biggest and most robust criminal justice data project anywhere in the country. I think the bad news is that if you do an inventory of Florida from a governance perspective, we really are tragically bad at intergovernment communications. And so it can be something as beneath the surface, so to speak, as criminal justice data, where we're trying to drive down and drill down to a level that we can start empirically showing that things work. Because the truth of the matter is no legislator in the history of Florida has ever voted on an appropriation or a bill with empiric scientific data that would rise to a publishable standard. Right? So if you understand that right now we're approximately a $90 billion budget, we make policy decisions, we make money decisions all day long, and the best we have is directional math. And then you look at a lot of our colleagues, and one of the things I stress when listening to Neil and his story and talking about the advocacy side, one of the things I always tell people is there's only two types of legislators. There are people who know what they want to be called, and there are people who know what they want to get done. And the people who care about the title and re-election aren't really going to move on something that's bold or visionary or reform-minded until you can prove to them that it's safe. Because they're scared that it's going to cost them their seat, it's going to cost them their chance at running for the Senate, or they're going to be president one day, their mom said so. And so they are just scared. And so I think one of the challenges for us, whether it's how we make Amendment 4 work so that the work of the people who got that passed can check the box of not just saying, okay, it's in the Constitution, but it actually operates in a way that we would expect it to operate to ensure that people who have paid their debt can validate across the different components of government that they've paid their debt, go up and register to vote, show up and vote, and not have their vote later contested. And so I would caution us on the criminal justice data, and we're actually having a presentation in our Judiciary Committee this coming week. I would caution us not to get too excited about the framework and forget about the execution. Because the enforcement of it, the application of it, data is as good as what's coming in. And so if we've got entities that are not participating, if we've got entities that don't want transparency, I don't think they're going to have friends in Senator Brandis or myself and some of our colleagues, but I think we're into that phase of it to say, look, it's time for that data to start telling that story. And I'd give an example that I was on a call today, and Jeff and I spoke somewhere the other night, and somebody walked up to us, and we were talking about criminal justice reform, and they said, what do you say to, law enforcement conservatives that say Florida's crime rate's at a 47% decline, it's at an all-time low? And I said to them, well, theoretically, we could take the crime rate to zero if we just locked everybody up. And so if crime rate's the only metric, sorry, you're all going to prison. But I was in a conversation today with a group that has no government funding, had no mandate or initiative to go into Sulphur Springs, and for any of you that are familiar with that area of Tampa, it would fairly be described as a very difficult area of Tampa. A completely pro bono, faith-based initiative has reduced crime in Sulphur Springs in 3 months, 46%. School attendance has gone up to a point that every child participating in that elective optional program had 100% attendance at school. So when we have the conversation about what does data mean, I think it's incumbent on us not to just let the conversation be dominated by the traditional notions of the criminal justice system as it has been or the status quo, and instead start asking ourselves, what is the objective? And as a recovering self-loathing lawyer, I'll never forget what my crim law professor asked us the open of class. She said, what is the purpose of the criminal justice system? And so I like to kind of play the game with some of my colleagues to say, look, here you have 100 jelly beans, and you can put as many jelly beans in each jar as you'd like. There's deterrence, because we think there's a societal good to deter bad actors. There's punitive accountabilities that say you did something bad and so you're going to get punished. There's restitution that says you hurt somebody and so you're going to pay that back, or whatever these buckets are. What's ironic is that when you have that in the philosophical or intellectually honest forum, nowhere does re-election come up. And I think that's really the challenge that we're having in some regards, is how do we get to a place where we ask our colleagues to look inward and say, what is the purpose of criminal justice? And is it truly conservative to continue throwing good money after bad if you're of Jeff and I's ideology? Or should we also be considerate about the tax dollar we're spending? Should we also be thinking about the dignity of each individual life and saying, where somebody is truly dangerous, then lock them up. We're scared of them, and we should be scared of them. But where somebody has the ability to be rehabilitated or diverted out, we ought to be exploring those things, we ought to be measuring those things, and we ought to be championing those things, because if we're not willing to take that posture, then I think that says more about us than the person who has committed or allegedly committed a crime.
So in that data, Bill, I think there was a lot of pushback in terms of, there's always, the negotiations that go on in the legislature, the sausage making of bill passage is not for the faint of heart. And
Order bacon
and in this case, the idea that we're waiting for something to happen, right? That we're waiting for a set of data to come miraculously to arrive and show us the way is look, we've got report after report. Senator Brandis, you can talk about all the work and effort that you have really led the charge for.
Well, I think the interesting thing that this data bill does, like we've had enough reports to tell us that the process of criminal justice in Florida has cancer. I think what we've done is create an MRI now that's going to also tell us that we have cancer. The problem that we run into is that the solutions for that cancer, whether it's an X-ray or an MRI, are the same. And we now have to be comfortable to have the conversations about what the solution and treatment is. I think the single best thing that the First Step Act actually did in Washington was to allow conservative legislatures to have a bold conversation about criminal justice at the state level and understand that there's air cover above us to have that conversation. I think after all the dust settles at the federal level, it was not major reform that was passed at the federal level by any stretch. It was good, it was positive that they passed it. And I'll be the first one to stand up and thank them for those measures. But what it did is it let the state legislators know that there's an opportunity to have a conversation and that you could point to both Republicans and Democrats at the federal level and see that none of them, I think, were politically harmed by making those moves. In fact, I guarantee you some of them will run on the fact that they passed criminal justice reform back home. By far, quietly, the single best thing, in my opinion, that happened with the First Step Act.
And can I add to that? Because I think, man, that's right on. I think that what you see in the criminal justice space right now, and it's been cultivated for years. I know I sit here as somebody who stands on the shoulders of people who have been working really hard for a long time. You do see a space where you can really have conversations built around people's experiences, the data, and in a way that transcends partisanship, even in one of the most dysfunctionally partisan time periods we've faced in a long time. I know when we think about kind of the next steps, and when we start talking to some of the returning citizens all across the state who are starting to register to vote and having conversations, it isn't a surprise. We've talked to thousands of folks, we've done surveys, and you see the data, and then you realize what you just said, Senator. Deep down, we do know some of these things, and it really is the ability to act that is the proper discussion. We know when we've talked to folks, it isn't even close. What are people who are trying to re-enter the community care about? They care about jobs, and they care about access to housing and opportunity, education. Those things are just every conversation wherever you are, whether you're in rural Florida, urban Florida, suburban Florida, black, white, rich, poor, people are all facing some of these same challenges. And so I think this space of criminal justice reform, and like you said, that the federal First Step Act allowed a conversation and a structure for that conversation to take place in which the normal partisan barbs aren't quite as sharp because of the cover, I think is what you said. So I appreciate that point a whole lot. And I think we're at a good spot for that because of that.
I think it's also how we message it and have the conversation, right? So if we just look at the political landscape, you have a very conservative Republican governor, you have a Republican Senate, and you have a Republican House. And so I'll stick with that ideology for a second. Jeff and I could probably compare notes over the years working on criminal justice reform stuff where people in our caucus as Republicans would say, oh, you boys are soft on crime, or you're liberal on crime, X, Y, Z. To which we like to ask them, why don't they care about the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendment the same extent they care about the 1st, 2nd, and 10th? And so I think in some part it's knowing who the audience is, right? I've always found it fascinating that in a lot of forums people say, man, you're really conservative. I'm really surprised by your stance. And I'm like, what's more conservative than making it really hard to lock up people? And I think that's part of the conversation. I think the other part of the conversation is you get the moat dragons that are fearful. I've had people during the criminal justice data package say to me, hey, Jamie, you're the tech guy. Like, help me understand. Would this potentially illuminate a judge that has racial disparities in sentencing? Yeah, it will. And they're like, oh, I don't know if that's a good thing. And I'm thinking to myself, like, what is more offensive than discovering where sentencing disparities are racially or socioeconomically, or an attorney that keeps getting sweetheart deals? That is not justice. And so you have people who have operated in the status quo who didn't understand that there would at some point be a way to reconcile and shine light on some of those behaviors. And so I think anytime you turn, the good news when we really get serious about data science, the good news is that once you turn that spigot on, it's almost impossible to turn it off. And it's not so much incremental as binary. In most regards, it's either on or it's off. And so there are going to be some people who are thoroughly embarrassed at some point by what we find. I don't care. Because at some point, it's like Mom always said, your character is what you do when nobody else is watching. And so because you wear a robe or because you're a state attorney and you think you can do something when nobody's watching, and you think you're never going to get caught or it's never going to be brought to light, I'm sorry. It might be brought to light and you'll be held accountable in the appropriate way. So I think there's a lot of good that happens, but I think we need to be having the conversation, understanding who the audience is, because I think Neil could probably shed light on some of their petition stuff and advocacy stuff. If he walks into a room that's a relatively liberal room by label and stereotype, of which I hate labels, but if he walks into a liberal setting, it's a little bit of a different conversation on this issue, right? Because you're talking to an audience of people who care inherently about different things. And I think when you're talking to people who claim to love the Constitution and claim to love the freedoms that this civilization uniquely recognized we're born with and not given by a king, that it means all of those freedoms. And that means we need to ardently care about free speech and free press and freedom of religion the same way we need to care about freedom from search and seizure and a trial by our peers and due process, because absent, and this is kind of where I'd sum on it, absent life, the most fundamental right is liberty. If you're not alive, liberty doesn't matter. I hate to break it to you. But if you're alive, nothing's more important than your freedom. And we have to ask ourselves the fundamental philosophical question of how hard should it be to take somebody's liberty? How much power should the government have? How much protection should you, the individual, have? And I think we're starting to see, I think, more and more traction on this, where we have more friends. Our dinner parties are bigger. They don't have to be in the back room and secretive, so to speak. So I am excited to see kind of what we can get done in that vein and understand that it will be kind of bite by bite and incremental progress in certain areas, but understanding the bigger mission and the bigger principle of preserving due process and simultaneously ensuring that the people who have committed those crimes are held accountable as appropriate.
So leadership here is really, obviously, leadership just showed up on our stage, which is fantastic, but we also have amid this like movement that I feel, and having watched it and talked about it with my board for years now, we really feel this is a moment, right, in criminal justice reform for Florida in particular, and a new governor who we really didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, campaigning and governing are completely different things. I don't have to tell the two of you, but it has been our observation that some interesting choices for agency heads, for instance. You guys are unfortunately looking at me tonight and probably would have been looking at Judge Marsteller instead. She was slated to take the helm as our chair today, and has instead, we're very grateful and pleased and honored that she has moved on and has decided to, she's running the Department of Juvenile Justice now. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on sort of where you think the state is headed. These signal to us some promise.
He'll make me go first on this one. I'll say this. I said in a lot of private conversations during the campaign side that I was kind of skeptical and nervous of what a candidate DeSantis would be as a governor. Doesn't have a lot of Florida experience, doesn't necessarily have ties to Florida policy. What I would say when you look at an executive is that there's two very distinct buckets. One is the substance, right? So take aside whether you like things that he has championed or don't like those things. The other is leadership style. And what I would tell you that I think is a very, very, very encouraging thing for people of all political persuasions is that we have a governor who fundamentally respects the three branches of government, who, having been a legislator, really does care what the legislature thinks. And I think that's a noticeable departure over the last 8 years. And I think that plays out in how agencies take shape. I think that plays out in the collaboration. And I think that something that empowers the legislative process more than the executive is a good thing for everybody, in the sense that it empowers the members that you elect or that you agree with to have a larger stake in the conversation. And so I have been incredibly encouraged by the interactions and the leadership and just the courage, whether you agree with removing Sheriff Israel or the Okaloosa superintendent or not. We can all agree that doing what he did in the first week of his governorship is a bold move. And so whether I disagree with some of our best friends in the process are very, very liberal Democrats. We don't often vote with them, but there's a very healthy respect. They know who they are, they know what they believe in, they know who we are, they know what we believe in. And when that respect exists, it becomes very easy to find common ground to say, let's go work on this issue where we both agree. And there's a lot of things that we don't agree on, and there's a lot of things that our constituents are going to think we're the devil because we do. But there are plenty of areas where we can come together. And I think over the last month, we've seen a much more collaborative environment, and something that I think excites me when we think about how we work on big policy ideas. And as Jeff, I think, very wisely and eloquently puts, every policy area has one big idea, let's go do that. That's been hard at times. I think we have a much more friendly environment to have bold conversations about criminal justice reform, let that debate play out in the legislative process, pass a product, and have a governor that respects the fact that the legislative body contemplated it, ultimately passed it, and give that great deference. So in that regard, and others, but I'm very excited about what I've seen so far.
And I'm going to speak briefly about not the governor, but the attorney general. So Ashley Moody comes from a prosecutorial background, but to me, more important for that role, that she's been a judge. I think you get a certain bent when you've been a prosecutor. You see the world in a certain way when you see the world as a prosecutor and frankly only been a prosecutor. But I think you see a very different side of the justice system when you've been a judge as well. And Ashley Moody was one of the youngest judges in the state of Florida and served honorably and nobly for years on the bench. And I think her ability to come in, because when Ron DeSantis calls somebody about some issue, one of the first people he's going to call is his attorney general. I think her ability to see the world as a judge and recognize that there's both sides, there's two sides to the argument, that sometimes the state isn't right when it makes those arguments. And ultimately, I'm somebody who believes that one of the things that we're going to have to address overall in Florida is the entire criminal justice code. This code that has not had a major overhaul in decades, and is arguably one of the most complicated sentencing codes and complicated criminal justice codes in the nation. But the ability to have a conversation, and I don't think it's going to happen this session, but I think to take a summer and to bring in experts and to sit down with them and say, we're going to have a data, research-driven discussion about what the criminal justice code should look like in this state. And to have at the helm of that conversation an attorney general who has been a former judge, I think puts us in a unique place in the history of the state of Florida and provides us a unique opportunity and pathway forward.
It's exciting, very exciting time. And I think, speaking of time, I think it's time for us to move into our audience and questions. I'm going to ask, I can't see, Jeff Kronschnabel? You're right here. He's going to come and help with the mic. And I would ask people to come up and I think we're just going to, are you going to take it here or are you going to walk it around? Okay. Limit it to just a question. People, you know, we've had these events several times and we often run out of time. We want to give everybody time and space to be able to interact with our distinguished panel.
Yeah, so what she's saying is, as you get in the line here, one question. If not, I pull the mic away like this. So please keep it to one.
This is why he does this job. I would not probably let go of the mic.
And
so.
if there's students here, you're going to get priority. So make sure you let us know if you're students.
Absolutely.
Okay,
There's
thanks.
the student.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, as a non-repentant criminal defense attorney for many, many years and then a civil rights and federal court attorney, I want to say that I really am glad to see you guys getting here. I knew Darren Rainey, who was 50 years old and was a schizophrenic, and he went into prison and was left, in fact, put into the shower until his skin was completely burned off his body. I know those guys. I stay with those guys now as I'm a retired attorney. What I want to say is I'm very concerned because I do see you guys coming from one direction. I appreciate that direction. I come from a very, very different direction. I spoke with Greg at a couple of things he probably doesn't remember. And I understand that there can be good when you have the Koch brothers and when you have ALEC and when you have the private sector doing all this work. What you don't have in here is the understanding of the individuals you're talking about. You know they need jobs, you know they need health care, you know when they get out, they're gonna need a lot of support. What I see you guys doing, and if you watch the new Jim Crow, you'll see where this ends up, is taking these private entities and saying, let's give these people less time in prison. Everybody here probably agrees in that. There's no doubt that they need to get out of prison by now. The problem I have is all of the different things that my clients had to do, they couldn't afford. They didn't have transportation. I went and spoke to prisons as an EEOC attorney about, you know, come to us if you see that you're not getting a job because you have a felony background. That can be a disparate impact. That can be illegal. The point being, you're sending these folks out, and what I'm concerned about is that you still have to make money if you're the Koch brothers. And you're sending them out with all of these different things that they're gonna have to do on whatever you wanna call it, if we bring back parole, whatever it is. And those folks are gonna end up going right back where they came from. So would Darren Rainey if he got out, if he hadn't been killed. And I worked with federal judges for 2 years, looking at a lot of prisoner complaints. We need to look at human beings differently. We can't just look at the data. We can't send these folks out and say we've done something in criminal reform. We can't just send them out and say they're going to have all these programs. When they get out, they can't afford it, they can't get to it, they're going to end up back in prison. So if you guys can talk about any of that and your concerns in that area, I appreciate it. Thank you.
I agree with you. I think one of the challenges that we face as lawmakers is we're like firefighters coming up to a house with every room on fire, and you kind of feel like, where do you start? And to your point, I think where I am is we've got to focus on diversion and transition, right? Because today, when you get out of prison, if you've served your time, you get $50 at a bus pass and are told to go with peace, right? And we wonder why people come back into the system, because we haven't taught them to read, we haven't stabilized them. It's like patients that we've triaged, and now that we've stopped the bleeding, we just put them back on the streets, but with no recuperation, with no physical therapy. We've got to get them. So how do we step down people and step back into some stabilization? And so I think we're going to have a conversation about transition. But you're right. Look, there is a lot going on in this space, and we have to figure out what are the one or two areas we can focus on any given year, and then use these long summers to do the bigger, bolder things.
And can I do that, or do you want to go ahead? I really appreciate the question, and I know that my experience in this is one in which you see the benefits of putting the person in the center of the conversation, like a real human being. I don't believe it's necessarily an either-or thing. Data is incredibly important. It illuminates in ways that can really help add depth to the story of the individual human. But to hear a human being say, hey, I was able to be a welder while I was on the inside, but I got out and I can't. Like, that speaks to values that all of us can share, no matter what our partisanship. So I think that this space really benefits from a conversation built around people and allowing people to have their voices heard in a constructive way. Understanding, learning the system. We should all learn. Like, what Senator Brandis said, I mean, that's great leadership. Like, we can't do everything all at once, but together we can take steps. And so I appreciate the question.
I would add to your point, if data was empirical, my truck was faster to get here tonight, horseback would have had me here on time. And so I say that to say, when we look at, and I'd echo some of the sentiments, I think there's a couple of things. Number one, we have failed historically to understand that the prison problem starts at interaction with law enforcement. There is a pipeline with which somebody suspected of a crime moves all the way through this pipeline, and they have either been diverted out at some point, they have paid their sentence, or they hit the end of the bus stop. I think there's a number of things. I will say that having what I truly believe, and I'm biased, is the best and brightest and most courageous mind in the Florida Senate sitting next to us and in our delegation, and somebody that I consider a dear friend, we're able to kind of go into houses sometimes, and Jeff says, I got this room, you got that room. And so I think you're going to see us focus on some different things that are symbiotic, that look at, for example, most people probably don't realize, I'm guessing with your background you do, there are no teeth to Brady violations. And for those of you who don't know what a Brady violation is, it is where a prosecutor willfully and intentionally withholds evidence that could be exculpatory. The biggest punishment for Brady violations is that you show up in a Netflix documentary 25 years later. It's patently offensive, right? So that is something. How we plea bargain, what the interaction of minimum mandatories and the 85% threshold. Is it really a plea bargain, or is somebody hostage saying, well, gee, I'm facing 20, I didn't do it, so I'll take 2? And I would culminate with this. One of my favorite writers, speakers, a guy named Arthur Brooks, who talks recently about the story that 1 is greater than 10 million. And it kind of touches on this point on data. And I'll make one clarification as much as I love your question. We didn't get here. I grew up in a house. I was always there. And I know that it is probably an anomaly for people to say, why is somebody so conservative, so passionate about these things? And it's the reasons I gave. But 1 is greater than 10 million. And Arthur tells a story about a guy he's working with, 30, 40-year-old African-American man who gets out of prison. Arthur, kind of big brother, big sister type mentality, says, I'm going to work with this guy. The $50 on a bus tab doesn't work. I'm going to talk to him. And at the time, Arthur had been going around Congress and he'd been displaying all this data, saying, here's what the data shows, here's what the data shows, and nobody's really taking action. And Arthur's sitting there having a cup of coffee with him one day. The guy's phone rings, and he's on work release. The guy's phone rings, and he says, hang on, Mr. Brooks. And he takes the call, and he starts weeping. Arthur said, what happened? And he said, well, my boss just called, and he said he needs me. He said, well, okay, well, get to work. What's the problem? He said, Arthur, nobody in my life has ever told me they need me. And so when we start having the conversation about the dignity of an individual life and understanding it, I think everything fits inside of that pipeline that says, how do we effectively make sure that the population at each stop of that pipeline is seen as a person, not a number, and we start asking ourselves, what's the most effective way to carry out what we believe the criminal justice system is? And then I think the last thing is, look, I think that the legislature is a great thing in the sense that there's a lot of minds, nobody's a king. But Jeff and I also have to kind of navigate, where we can line up the House and Senate, where we can line up our committees, where we can line up those things. And so sometimes we have to take less than we'd want, but it is a step forward. And Neil, I think, will nod. I'll give you a better question. Neil asked me at a criminal justice summit 4 months ago at Stetson, he says, what do you think about Amendment 4? And we got into a longer conversation. I said, I kind of don't like it. I think there's some flaws with it. But here's my biggest problem. It singles out voting. Look at occupational licensing. How many jobs can a felon not come? So if we're gonna buy in, and in this regard, I'm telling Neil, hey, I like what you're doing from a restoration perspective, but why is voting the only right that is back when the debt is paid? And so I think you're gonna look at us, I think you're gonna see the House, I've said very publicly, I think you're gonna see the House, and Neil and I are talking about, we met last week, and I think Neil will back me up on this publicly. But I told him, I said, look, I want to know everything that a felony conviction bars somebody from doing and have an honest conversation. If the principle is that restoration has happened and a debt has been paid, then why are we putting things in statute that make it harder for that person to go be individually dependent?
All right, I'm going to challenge us to get through all of these questioners.
Thank you. I'm going to try to be very brief, if this.
The problem isn't you guys.
So I find myself uniquely situated in that I have a sister that is a convicted felon that is going through the very difficult task of working her butt off to make sure she has a life now after prison. And I am in a relationship with a sheriff's deputy. And so I am a supporter of law enforcement. But the fact that I have to say that I'm uniquely situated as if those are adversaries is part of the problem. And from conversations with my boyfriend, I am acutely aware of two different things. One is that there is a systemic problem in that institution, and not with all law enforcement officers, clearly, because I wouldn't be in a relationship with somebody that I didn't believe in their morals, and he's doing a good job. But there are problems in that institution. As the other thing I'm acutely aware of is that they have a lot of power, as it was touched on a little bit with you guys talking, of who gets arrested, what they get charged with. They have a lot of power in that as well. So I kind of have a question is if you're taking correctional officers that are understaffed, overworked, and are surrounded by criminals all the time, and then you said that the sheriff's departments are poaching them as employees, is that really, I mean, you said yourself that you thought it was better to have an attorney general that was a judge because prosecutors come from a very specific kind of viewpoint because of what they're used to. That's the same thing when you're taking correctional officers and putting them in the sheriff's department, and you're just creating this vicious cycle. And that's a part that needs to be reformed as well, and what's going to be done about that when it's something inherent in the system.
Yeah, you're right. Look, we have a lot of problems with our corrections officers right now. There is no doubt about that. We're under federal investigation at Lowell Women's right now. We have a huge contraband problem. If you think the drug problem is bad outside the walls of prison, you should see it inside the walls of prison. We have a spice problem. We have a problem with our age. The age of deaths in the state prisons is going down, right? It's not because the average age of inmate that's dying is going, it's because the average age of inmate that's dying is going down because we have inmate violence, we have officer abuse, we have drug problems throughout prison, and we have a huge challenge right now inside the prison facilities. But these are all symptoms of understaffing. These are all symptoms of a correction system that's in crisis. And all you have to do is go read some of the stories online from the news articles about what's going on at some of these prison facilities, whether it's putting people in the shower or wardens that make the inmates call them daddy, right? At Lowell Women's, we have that is what the situation that General Inch, who's the new Secretary of Corrections, is going to find himself facing. And one of the biggest challenges that the legislature has to do is to support him in making some of these changes and recognizing that we have to pay guards more. They're recognizing that we have to think about the shifts that they're on, because they can't work 12-hour shifts, go sleep for 6 hours in a FEMA trailer that's on the property and come back in and work another 12-hour shift and think that that's rational, normal, and good for anybody in the system, because it's not.
I've got 10 seconds. I'd love to talk to you afterwards to talk to your boyfriend about getting engaged in civic engagement stuff, so thank you.
Hi, my name is Julie Chorga-Gilson. I'm a St. Petersburg College student. I'm in the public policy program. So my question's related to public policy from a student perspective. What would be the most effective way for students or younger people to be heard or be effective in changing policies here in Florida? Part of that is, I feel like, just general observations, perhaps it's like the demographics of Florida, or is it a matter of the people who vote affect the policy, which leads to a certain partisan legislature? So my question is, what is the problem? How can a public policy student or students in general be more involved or effective in Florida government?
I'll take this one for us. I touched earlier on everybody in the legislature either wants to know what they want to be called or what they want to get done. And one of the inherent challenges of public policy is that there is no metric, there's no currency, there's no quantitative scoreboard. The real scoreboard is re-election, and that's a really flawed metric. So for Jeff, for myself, for others who don't care if you walked up into my office and said, hey, Jamie, I want you to change your mind on this vote that you're ideologically convicted on, or I'm going to rally 100,000 people to vote against you. I'm going to look at you and say, have at it. Because I'm going to do what I believe in, and the worst thing that happens if I lose my election is I make more money, I see my family more often, I have more free time, I get to more Auburn football games. It doesn't sound that bad. And on the flip side, somebody who only cares about the title of re-election, you're probably pretty persuasive, right? So I think the first thing in the advocacy space is understand who my audience is and what they care about, and understand that in the Capitol, whether it's in DC or Tallahassee, somebody in a world where there is no currency, there is no way to quantitatively score public policy. That's one. Two, let people know you're a constituent. In our office, we have a calendaring hierarchy. If somebody's a constituent, they jump everything else. And so getting engaged in that capacity. And then three, and I don't mean this to sound harsh, but this is going to be blunt, know the issue. And I say that because people are coming into our office all day long and they have read something that is completely inaccurate. They're using that to cite that to tell me why I should change my mind. And after a 20-minute conversation of me asking them questions and said, well, instead of this, if this was the case, would you agree with me? Oh, yeah, well, I didn't know that. And so I think it's like anything in life. Know what you're doing, understand who the audience is, and then don't get discouraged. Because quite frankly, if Jeff and I got discouraged every time we lost a policy fight, we would have retired a long time ago. And we just have to be steadfast in it.
I'm going to add a little bit to this too, because we are a partnership with St. Pete College and Tallahassee Community College and Florida State University. All of our projects we leverage student talent. You can get engaged in research, real policy research that actually has an impact, and work with folks like us. So Professor Kronschnabel is a direct link to me, which is a direct link to the work we're doing, and I encourage you to talk with him about that as well.
And I'll just add that to me, the most effective thing is to tell me a story. I want to hear your story. I want to hear your situation or a situation that you're related to. I had a mom come see me last week. When I was in Tallahassee, I tweeted out that I was going to be in Tallahassee for 2 days. And she read that, and she called my office, and she drove at 30 minutes to come see me, and she told me a story about her son, who at 21, he was 43 now, he's my age. He said at 21, he was arrested while he was out on probation, and got charged with armed robbery and serving life in prison without parole. And she said, he's 43 now, and I move to whatever prison, to be close to whatever prison he's at. And she says, what do I do? How do I interact with the legislature? She goes, wait, and the one question she said to me, she says, do I ever have a chance of seeing him outside of prison ever again? And I said, ma'am, I will never bet against a mom and a story in this process. I will tell you the most powerful thing you can do is find a legislator that believes in your story and is willing to listen to that and to keep telling that story over and over and over again to 160 members of the legislature.
Okay, thank you.
Good evening, Reverend Russell Meyer, Florida Council of Churches. There was just a little bit of conversation touching on disparities. And at some of your last remarks, Senator, about the complexity of the code. The school-to-prison pipeline is driven by the number of touches a person has, so that when they get into court, oftentimes they end up having a more adverse sentence than somebody in a school that doesn't have a lot of police presence, never been touched. What hope is there for taking a new look at the point system and really looking at it through the eyes of racial equity and disparity, and begin to dial back what has happened because of SROs and the way young people get touched in some schools by law enforcement, but don't get touched in other schools?
Yeah, I think Florida's policy of moving towards civil citations has been radically effective, and we will only see that policy grow over time. I think it's part of its training, part of its just local practice, and I think we have to give some local control to state's attorneys to determine how they want their communities to look. I think that's why we elect them and ask them to do the very difficult job that we've asked them to do. But I think giving state's attorneys and local communities access to civil citations has been wildly successful. In fact, it's been so successful we've extended that to adults. But I think part of it's going to be the data bill that we've passed is going to help. I think part of it's going to be education. Part of it's the ability to divert people into civil citations, and creating more diversion options in communities that are effective, I think, is key.
I think it's a fascinating question in the sense that I tell people all the time, 90% of the problems that I'm confronted with in the legislature would be solved with strong family structures in society. We can't legislate that. We also can't legislate outcomes, but I think we can legislate opportunities. And I think when we talk specifically about the school-to-prison pipeline, we need to be really sober and really, really transparent with ourselves that our current education system is incredibly discriminatory. And so when we start having the conversation about educational freedom, I had a gentleman, we talk about a story, I had a gentleman interviewing me from the Tampa Bay Times who comes from a very different bent on school choice. Very much traditional public schools, the only model that works, anything that threatens it is bad. We started having a conversation. I said, Ernest, what do you tell the single mother working 3 jobs to try and send her first kid to college, the first kid in her family ever to go to college, that he's going to go to a school that is a school-to-prison pipeline simply because she doesn't have the money, simply because of the zip code he was born in, and simply because they don't have the connections to go get in line or jump the lottery at some magnet or charter school? And I think we have to be really honest and get outside of this food fight that's happening when you think about education policy in the state, and start asking ourselves, is it okay that a current system tells that mother her kid's doomed? Can't get out. And this reporter looked at me and he said, yeah, but what about the family that doesn't have the engaged mom? What about the kid that doesn't have the engaged mom? I said, look, it's a binary choice. We either take a system that holds hostage the parent that's trying to end generational poverty by sending a kid to college, or we pick a system that can't legislate equality of outcomes because we can't, but we can give everybody opportunity. And I think one of the most fundamental things we can do to transform the school-to-prison pipeline and our criminal justice system in general is to give absolute, outright, unfettered educational freedom in this state that empowers and puts parents and families and teachers first. That alone will transform what we're seeing in this space.
Quick statement before we go on. Back in the day, I did dignitary protection. One time I had Red Skelton. You all remember Red Skelton? Well, he's about 85 years old. He'd finished his show up at Ruth Eckerd, and I would say, you ready to go? And he says, no. I'm staying till every one of my constituents, every one of the people in the audience that wants to come back to see me, sees me. Well, I thought the character was off the charts because most people that I was with didn't do that. Well, let me tell you something. Your panel here is willing to stay as long as you want to stay. So everybody in line right now is going to have their question answered. I know we said 8 o'clock, but if you have to go, we understand you have to go, but we're staying. So thank you.
I thought we had moved a long way past Jean Valjean and 24601 and castigating someone for the rest of their life for stealing a loaf of bread. And I find a play that has so much charisma to it and is so loved seems to translate still today in people wanting to penalize others. I received a barrage of phone calls as a snowbird when I arrived here in Florida at the beginning of November, saying that if the amendment was passed, there'd be all sorts of murderers that got a chance to vote. What do we do about the dissemination of absolutely reprehensible and wrong information to people? Somehow there's a lot of money out there to make those phone calls. It wasn't a human being, so I couldn't even talk to them and say, you're wrong. It was just a recording. But there are people that would believe that mis and disinformation. What do we do about that?
I'll take it as the lawyer because there's not much we can do, unfortunately. 1960s Supreme Court case that handles defamation effectively makes it impossible to sue somebody for defamation unless you can establish that they knew what they were saying was a lie. And so they can bald-faced lie. The press can, I actually got into it on Twitter today with a reporter and said, listen, if we're going to have a conversation about gun-free zones, let's get it straight. Let's talk about what a gun-free, an outright bald-faced lie that people will believe. And when we get back to the conversation about an engaged electorate, the integrity of elections, accuracy of information, truth in journalism, truth in campaigns, is fundamental and paramount. It's very frustrating because the defamation standards in this country effectively make it impossible. And I'll give you something to look for. I think what you saw the Russians do in the 2016 election is about to get deployed in corporate America. When you think about the way that people use information to troll and to get a completely false narrative out there, doing it against or for a presidential campaign is no different than doing it against a business, a school, or anything else. And so I'm hopeful that we can, I've actually been having some conversations with some folks to try and come up with some creative ways that we can comply with existing Supreme Court law that rendered us pretty weak on defamation. So I hate to be bad news, there's not much other than the principles of free speech. So I don't want to censor speech. The answer to offensive speech is to make sure my speech is louder and more effective and more mobilized. And so keep up the work, keep doing what you're doing. But the reality is it's a barrier you have to overcome because whether it's a newspaper that says it about us, a campaign that says it about an initiative, there ain't much you can do other than go make the case door by door, neighbor by neighbor.
Hello, my name is Kathy Carlin, and I'm a mother of an incarcerated woman. She was at Lowell Correctional for 5 years, 5 years of hell for both of us. I think just being a mother of an incarcerated person, hearing stories from other mothers, from former inmates, from inmates, this is really a humanitarian crisis, the way that our fellow human beings are being treated in the criminal justice system. And it's just, you know, I had no idea until my daughter became incarcerated. But my main question is, they basically kicked her out of Lowell because I'm an advocate, and she got sent to Gadsden Correctional. Thank you, Senator Brandeis, for getting sanitary pads to Gadsden. So she goes from Lowell, where there's nothing. She was a canteen worker for 5 years. But other than that, there's really nothing for the women to do. And then she goes to Gadsden, which is a private prison. And, I mean, they've got inmate barbecues. She's in the dog program. She's a yoga instructor. I mean, you know, they have just, I mean, every time I talk to her, it's like, really? You get to do that? They have art supplies.
The facility's air-conditioned.
It's completely different. So I don't know why, if it can happen there, why it can't happen at a place like Lowell. We tried for 5 years just to get colored pencils so they could draw. And my daughter can draw and, you know, just have access to all sorts of things. So What's the difference? That's my question.
I'm going to go first on this briefly, and then Jeff's going to go. I think the difference is anytime private prisons comes up as a political debate, the only attack that's made is that legislators who support private prisons are bought and paid for by the private prisons companies. And as long as that narrative persists, there's going to be a lot of legislators that are scared to go down that path. And I think getting that story out is powerful, because the reality is those facilities, most of the problems we're having, and Jeff can speak to this at length, most of the problems we're having are not in the private facilities. But the debate in Tallahassee is that if you're going to support private prisons, you're doing it for lobbyist money, you're doing it for re-election, not because it's better policy.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. I have a question, and a couple of you sort of referenced it when you were speaking. It's about the racial disparity in everything in Florida. I'll just say Groveland floor and go from there. I would hope that everyone on your committee has seen 13, that's Ava DuVernay's documentary, or have read the book, New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And what those really talk about is, at least I can talk from my personal experience, the criminal justice system begins with the police. And in this community, in the state of Florida, there's an inordinate amount of status given to police officers. So what do you do when you talk about criminal justice reform and you do nothing about how the police interact with their citizens, especially now that we know the evidence says that the state of Florida has a huge racial disparity in arrest?
Greg? Just joking. So I think there's a couple of things that we're doing. I'm sponsoring a bill, I sponsored it last year, that would require recording of all interrogations, right? Here it is, 2019, and for $50 I can buy a video camera and put this stuff on the web for basically forever on recorded interrogations, but we have some jurisdictions that refuse to record interrogations of murder, of when they're, so that the prosecutor and the defendant, both the defense, has an accurate representation of what was said, not just somebody's notes. It costs us nothing to do. The cameras are virtually free. And that's one key thing that we're working with the Innocence Project on, to simply record accurately video or audio of confessions, of interrogations. I think that will go a long way to helping, at least at the back end. But you're right. I think the data bill is another way that we're going to try to help to disseminate some of this information, and we'll learn a lot more.
I think some of it's philosophical. So to Jeff's point, we talked about Brady violations earlier. I'm going to say something that might sound provocative at first, but I think you'll agree with me at the end of it. It ought to be really hard to appeal a conviction. And it ought to be really hard to appeal a conviction because we got the trial level so right. Today, what we have is a fast-tracked conviction status and a long and arduous limited appeal process. One of the things we're looking at in our committee is, in talking with Jeff, facilitating a way for a defendant who wants to bear the cost to test evidence in a controlled environment as forensic science updates. If we're not willing to take every step possible to make sure that we have the right person, and if we transform the way we look at criminal justice, rather from a rocket docket on the front end to get through a case file, but instead understand that a life and freedom is at stake, there ought not be much left to appeal. And so if I was a prosecutor, I'd want to record every custodial interrogation the way Jeff wants to see it done. I'd want to know that forensic science is not just a misnomer, but is applied the way that DNA revolutionized things 10, 15, 20 years ago. So I think you see a philosophical shift a little bit from guys like us, wanting to see the conviction and adjudication process be much slower, much more painful, and much more transparent, so that the appeal process is much less significant because the evidence, the testimony was brought to light in a way that was transparent and appropriate to get to the right answer.
Hi, my name's Deb Frank. I'm a mental health therapist. I work in the jail system. It's kind of a new field for me. I've worked in communities before and such, and that's been kind of eye-opening for me, what actually happens in the jails. I work in booking, and I'm the one who gets called up about 1 in 20 people who have a mental health issue, past suicide attempt, on medication or whatever. And I've noticed that, and this is just anecdotal, not based on data, but I've noticed that a significant number of those people are in for trespassing because they wouldn't leave the 7-Eleven because they're talking to their uncle that was dead, and so they got arrested for it. Or they just, or various other things that end up getting escalated because we call them our frequent flyers, because I can basically go to our system because they get arrested over and over and over again because we release them. They come in, we put them on meds, they leave, they can't get meds. They're back on the street, they're living homeless, they can't get a job, they can't keep a job, their family doesn't want anything to do with them, they end up taking drugs because they're easier to get than their meds. And I mean, I know it's a big problem. I mean, the bottom line for me is that they actually don't belong in jail. But I'm just wondering, are there ideas about how to reform that part of what's happening with that particular population?
It involves doing a risk assessment when people walk in the door and addressing their risks, because those people who are psychotic are very high risk to reoffend, as you're pointing out. And allocating resources to those individuals who are very high risk, and allocating away resources from those people that are very low risk. If somebody's a 1 in 10 risk of having recidivism, why are we spending resources there versus the 7 in 10 people that are very, very high risk to reoffend? And how do we stabilize those individuals on the back end? But that's a choice, and that's a conversation about risk assessments. There's some that don't want to have that conversation. Specifically, bail bondsmen don't want to have that conversation.
Hello, my name is Lou Murray, and I'm from the Sarasota, Manatee County area. And I've been working with a group called SURE. I don't know if you're familiar with them. They're about 16, 17 interdenominational religious groups, including synagogues and mosques and Unitarian, Presbyterians, and Catholics. And we've had some successes with the civil citation. That's been going on pretty good in Sarasota County and with the schools. We still got a ways to go, but that seems to be catching on, stopping the pipeline school to prison pipeline. And we've been meeting with the county sheriff department and the criminal justice department. And like somebody said, you got to find common ground. What is it that you need from me, and what did I need from you? And the word came up, recidivism rates. And when we talk with the sheriff's department and the criminal justice department in that area, that seemed to be a common ground. You know, how can we work to lower that? And so programs that we heretofore have been talking about that wasn't being considered, they're looking at. For example, we're looking at agribusiness for returning citizens and also community education centers and stuff like that. And I just want to say, how can we maybe use that more? Do you think that's going to be a good point of common ground to work with business and law enforcement with our churches and community groups?
Absolutely, 100%. That's the case. I think the legislature and where you're going to find the most support right now is in two areas. One is diversion, the other one is transition. The hard part is the criminal justice code, and we're going to work on that over the summer, but I think you're going to see us put a lot of effort into diversion and transition. And then my desire is to focus on risk assessments and understanding that we're going to look at the very high risk individuals, these people that have a real problem with recidivism. You know, they're 7, 8 out of 10 are going to be back in trouble with the law, and try to focus our efforts on those individuals as much as we can.
I think you're hitting on something that's important. when you talk about advocacy, to the young lady that asked earlier, if I get a group of disparate stakeholders together, I've got churches of different faiths, I've got the sheriff's office, I've got jails, I've got all if we'll all agree on the objective, that's powerful. And so when you think about recidivism, it kind of checks all the boxes. The super tough on crime people really want to lock everybody up and throw them away forever because they're scared of something bad happening. Well, if we've reduced recidivism, that inherently mathematically means that person didn't do something bad again. When we think about people who want to see restoration, rehabilitation, and see this as a humanitarian issue, recidivism is a metric that points directly at it to say, we're doing a good job because they're not coming back. And so whether it's that issue or any other, I'd encourage you to focus on an objective that everybody agrees is good, that's measurable, demonstrate the success of it, and continue growing from there.
And can I just say something, man? Thank you. Like, what you're doing is an example for other people. So for your willingness to come out here and share brings encouragement to somebody in this room, and I know I'm one of them, so thank you.
You're like a big teddy bear, Neil. I love you for that.
Yeah, these guys are like brilliant, so I got to have my little lane, and I'm just going to say thank you to everybody.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here. I actually had the privilege of working with Senator Evers about 2013. I'm a mom. My son was incarcerated. He actually never had a trial. He was getting ready to go to trial. His lawyer told him to plead, and he got slammed. And he wasn't even guilty of the crime. So for the last 10 years, I've been involved in advocating for criminal justice reform, prison reform. I've been to down to Senator Rundle's office when Darren Rainey, that whole situation there. But getting back to Senator Evers, Ryan was at a prison in Swanee where they were killing inmates. Ryan was working in laundry, and they would bring in the beds, and they would, they'd spray them, but when they'd lift them up, there'd be nothing but pools of blood underneath of the beds and broken teeth and brain matter all over. And my son caught MRSA from cleaning up after all of this and brought it home to me, and I almost died last March. I got an infection from being around there. Now, my attorney, who just recently passed, Mr. Barry Cohen, has been trying to get Ryan, working with the state attorney, Andrew Warren, because they have a CRU unit that collects the data for inmates, and, the criminal justice system, and see where they, went wrong. And what I'm wondering is, how is it that we can help? We want to, help the moms, the advocates, and do whatever we can, because they are human beings. They're somebody's child, somebody's brother, sister, friend, and they're not all bad. They made a mistake.
I'll say join FAM.
I am actually, and Florida Cares is another.
Yeah. So FAM stands for, well, it used to stand for Families Against Mandatory Minimums, and we were named that because our founder and former President Julie Stewart, her brother, served 5 years in federal prison on a marijuana charge. And what she learned very early on, it was clear, is that the families served the time along with the person who's actually incarcerated. And so she was compelled to name it Families Against Mandatory Minimums because there were so many people like her that she found. She didn't think there would be, but over the course of the entire country, she found thousands of people in the same situation. And FAM started as a means of bringing people together who had similar interests and had similar experiences so they could share those experiences with one another, learn from one another, and then also train to become effective advocates, not only on behalf of their loved ones, but for changes in public policy as well. So we have a full-time project in Florida, and we just partnered with a group called Florida Cares.
Yes.
And if anybody is familiar with that group, you should absolutely join up. They have a weekly call for people. Again, my son, my daughter is here. Here's the experience. And you can learn from one another. Here's how we dealt with it. Here's who to call for this or whatever. And we're working right now to sort of build this army of advocates that can go to Tallahassee and go talk to legislators in the district and say, here's what's actually happening. I mean, my God, that is an awful story, right? Nobody knows that's going on.
Right.
to be able to, and it's an intimidating thing, right? To call a legislator, to go to a legislator. I'm uncomfortable with it.
I've done
Like
it.
8 years later, it's still like, I don't want to bother these guys right now. But you have to, right?
Yeah.
So, train, learn, know who they are, where they're going to be. There are delegation meetings that are happening right now. Make sure you show up to those and become, again, an effective advocate so you can tell your story and move these folks who can actually vote on these things. And it's it's easy to say, right? Oh, become an advocate, right? But it's a long and often difficult, and it takes time and organizing is not immediate. Right, ask Neil. Organizing takes a lot of time and a lot of energy and a lot of effort. We have full-time organizers in Pennsylvania. All they do is go around and meet 3 people, 5 people at a time in coffee shops and just little bite-sized things. And over time, you build the army. That's what Florida Cares is doing here. That's what FAM is doing here. And so, with all the social networking out there and everything, we can come together. We just have to start doing it, and we are. So if you already know Florida Cares, you already know FAM, just keep doing it. Talk to everybody you know. Anytime you go visit a prison, somebody else is there. Hey, you join Florida Cares? You join the call?
Yes,
have you gone to
we
the
do
FAM
that.
website? Yeah, exactly. Just keep doing it. It's that over time, right?
Yes.
And so just keep doing what you're doing is what I'd say.
Yeah, we've been in it for 10 years, so
Yeah.
we've been, ever since I found out what was going on, I had to do something, because if I didn't, I'd be just as bad as them, and I couldn't do that.
To your point that people haven't done what you've done, I was joking with Neil about being a teddy bear. He can play like he's just the soft, cuddly, nice guy. And he is that, but he's also remarkably intelligent. But one of the things that I think your story and Neil's and many others represent is that it's very easy to have something bad happen in your life and see only the liability side of the balance sheet. And the reality is it's a powerful asset. Amendment 4 doesn't happen if Neil saw his experience only as a liability. And so understand the power that you have in your story, or understand the power that you have in the communities you go into. Jeff and I talked a little bit about, and Greg, we have this relatively small group 5-6 years ago of like actual conservatives who care about this issue. Well, the more we started talking to people, 5 turned into 7, turned into 8, turned into 9, because people started looking and going, wait, you guys are like super conservative and you care about criminal justice reform? I don't get it. Conversations happen. And so the brand that Jeff and I carry and how we vote, Neil and the way that he carries himself, Greg and his doggedness and witty sarcasm on Twitter are all effective. So understand what resources you have individually and don't be scared to use them.
Yes, sir, thank you. Thank you all very much. God bless you.
Hope I make it through this. Hi, my name's Terry, and I have a loved one locked up in Lake Butler. He's sick. He's on kidney dialysis. He's locked in a dorm, the hottest dorm on the compound. There's no air conditioning. So in the summer, he loses between 20 and 30 pounds. There's rats. There's cockroaches. The officers are beating people. They're putting them in confinement. There's pull downs that shows that trays are going in. There's no food in there. They're starving them. So I just wonder, I understand, I follow you guys, so I'm in FAM, I'm in Florida Cares. I follow all of you. So my concern is, I understand you're trying to get all this done, but what are you going to do about these conditions of these prisons? Because they're living like in a concentration camp. And it breaks my heart. I hope I don't start crying. It breaks my heart that he has to sleep in there every night. He's on a minimum mandatory. He's done 13 years, and he shouldn't even be there. It was one word against another word. So, and I've tried everything I can to get him out of there. He can't go to the law library. There's nothing for them to do except lay around in a dorm all day, do nothing. And he's melting away.
Let me say, so for most of the time that we did it at FAM, it's been sentencing reform, right? We want to change sentencing laws. And eventually we came to the point where prison conditions became such an overwhelmingly, it was just a necessary thing to start looking at. Not only were people like you who are members of FAM and involved in FAM keep telling us, right? Like, why aren't you doing this? And eventually we said, of course we ought to be doing it. We have a network. We have some, some people who listen to us on some things, and we should. And let me say, I mean, I think it's like Texas and Florida and maybe another one that doesn't have air conditioning in prisons. That's insane.
It is.
This is a state that's built on air conditioning. And no offense to anybody in the audience, but I mean, air condition the prisons. I mean,
At least move
Yes,
the
it's going to cost some
dialysis
money.
patients
These are
and the
human
cancer
beings. We
patients
should
to
put
an
air conditioning in the prisons.
air-conditioned
At the
dorm.
very least, we should put air conditioning in the prisons.
Yeah.
That should be something that we can do.
Exactly.
Yes, it's expensive. Find the money.
The dialysis patients and the cancer patients are in the hottest dorm on that compound. And when the officer gets pissed off, he shuts the fans
Yeah,
off.
I think it's what, 86 days a year in Florida where it's 90 or
it's
above
hot
here
in there. It's
in
hot.
prisons. I mean, it's inhumane.
It is human.
Find the money.
Yeah.
And you know what? You can find the money by doing the things that we're asking you to do, by reducing the prison population, by diverting low-level offenders. We talk about these low-level offenders. We got 13,000 of them that OPAGA just found in the state of Florida. 13,000 people, and the findings were that for the low-level offenders, prison actually increases their recidivism rate, which means that we're asking you guys to pay more money, and in exchange, we're giving you more crime, while warehousing people in these hellhole prisons for God knows how long.
And you're
Fix
paying
it.
all this money for dialysis. You've got so many dialysis patients in there right now that are low-level crime people. I used to work the county jail, so I know. And you're paying all this money to dialyze these inmates that could be out here doing something productive, maybe, or going on probation, but yet you're locking them in this prison, and they're dying.
And I hate to say it, but it is just simply politically easier to ignore that.
And
It's
people
simple.
don't
It's
know what goes
politically
on
easier
until you
to
deal with
pretend that those people don't exist.
Yeah.
We lock them up, we throw away the key, we pretend that they don't exist anymore, and then you go election after election after election.
And I don't
But
speak
and
too
again,
much
it's the
because there's
same.
retaliation, you know.
Sure.
I hate to go to visitation because they make it so uncomfortable for you. I'm just going in here to see my other half. You don't need to make it uncomfortable for me. You got to call people inmate, inmate. He has
Yeah.
a name. He has a name. She hasn't called him that yet, but
Yeah.
I wouldn't say nothing because
Well,
then she's going to take him to the back and
And I
beat
know
him.
that it's repetitive, but the answer is the same. You have to tell the story,
Yeah.
right? And you have to tell the story to the people who matter. It's not just me. It's these guys on stage. It's the people in your district, wherever it is. You just have to tell the story, and you have to keep telling it. I mean, Representative Graham mentioned it. Like, I don't shut up because why, right?
I meant it as a compliment.
Yeah, like you have to keep. If no one's listening to you, you have to keep talking,
Well,
right?
thank you for listening because
So-
I'm speaking for them.
Please
and by
do,
the way,
and
he
keep it
wanted
up.
me to ask you if you guys can let him come home now. I said I'll ask. I don't know
Yeah.
if that'll work.
Yeah. Would that it were up to us.
Hi, my name is Andrew Davis. I'm a student here at SPC in the Public Policy and Administration program, and I hope to go to law school and eventually become a politician. But you talked a little bit.
I'll talk you out of both of those. Neither. We're hanging out later.
Say a prayer, man. Well, all right.
He can take politics, I'll take law school.
But you talked a little bit about rehabilitating prisoners and criminals. But at what point does the state's responsibility end for rehabilitating those criminals, and the criminals need to take their own personal responsibility to make their own lives better?
100%, you're correct, right? We have to separate, as Representative Grant talked about, we have to separate the people that we're scared of from the people that we're mad at. The people that we're scared of, they need to go to jail for a long, long time until they're too old and frail to do harm to other people, right? The people that we're mad at, we need to focus on how there's a punitive portion for what they've done, and then we need to focus on correcting their behavior, and we need to focus on getting them back into society to be productive members of society. I think those are the two fundamental ways that we need to think about the criminal justice system, and that's the struggle that we're trying to overcome here.
It's a great question. I'd add to it, I agree with what Jeff said, but I think the other thing I'd add to it is going back to when I was mentioning education. Whether it's diversionary programs, whether it's economic opportunities, whether it's the criminal justice system, we cannot possibly legislate outcomes. Equality of outcomes is impossible. We can, however, legislate opportunity. And opportunity in this space, to your point, as I think you really wisely touch on, is only going to be effective if that person takes advantage of that opportunity, right? So this is not to suggest that the programs and the reforms are a stipend into their bank account every month and they don't have to do anything. It's to suggest that they're going to have an opportunity to put themselves on a productive path, but we're not just going to set them up to fail with $50 and a pat on the backside. And I think there's something in between that says, listen, to the extent you recognize that you've paid your debt, you've done your time, and you don't want to be a convicted inmate, you're going to have a pathway and an opportunity to not be, but ultimately that decision's up to you. And I think it's really important, as you point out, that those programs do in fact ensure that somebody's taking the pride of ownership and the pride in their own life to say, I never want to go back here. I want to keep moving up.
I'll just add one thing. I know it's 8:20, but so personal responsibility often it also takes place within particular structures, right? So if I leave prison and I can't get a job because I can't get the license that allows me to get the job and so on, that's not just failing to take personal responsibility. That's the structure preventing me from taking personal responsibility. And I'd add also, I mean, we also, even some of our policies create disincentives for doing that, right? We have the 85%, there's the cap on the gain time. Well, if I go get my high school diploma or vocational certificate or something, it's not like I get a little time off for that, right? Like once I hit my gain time, I'm done. The system creates no incentives for me to better myself. And yeah, you could say, well, you should do it on your own. Well, okay, we should all be millionaires, I guess, but reality hits us from time to time. And so we can change the structure of the system to create those incentives to make it easier for people to accept personal responsibility and make themselves better, but it's going to take some political choices that we have to make. We have to say, like, can you give 60 days on the back end of a sentence if they earn a high school diploma? Well, what if that takes 85% to 84%? Oh, is that sacrosanct, that additional 1%, that's 60 days at the tail end of a 5-year sentence versus a vocational certificate? Well, that's a trade-off. That's a trade-off that we're going to have to make to decide which is better in order to help somebody to get personal responsibility and take responsibility for their lives versus just, or is this particular system so, we just can't touch it for that. And these are political choices that we're going to have to make. So it isn't just, a binary, is this guy taking personal responsibility or not? Look at the structure in which that personal responsibility has to be taken to see if there are, barriers to doing that.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Audrey Jennings Hudgens, and I'm so nervous, so just bear with me. But I'm the mom that Senator Brandes talked about earlier. And Gloria, come up here, hon, please. Sorry. Anyway, I live in Tallahassee, and I came down here tonight because, like Senator Brandes said, tell my story. My son was 21 years old when he was sentenced under Florida's PRR law. And he had served 15 months when he was 18. This was all drug-related, of course. And I will say, thank you, I will say when he was, when he served his first sentence, he received no drug treatment. He was told that he wasn't, this was back in '96 when things were worse in many ways than they are now. There have been some improvements along the way here and there, but the entire 15 months, he did work for Department of Transportation. And we have no complaints with work and him working, but for him to serve 15 months and receive no education, no counseling, no drug treatment, but he worked. When he got out, he relapsed, and my son was guilty. He was guilty. He committed armed robbery. He's serving a life sentence for that. He did not, thank God, kill anyone. He did not physically harm anyone. There was no ambulance called. No one went to the hospital. He didn't hit anybody over the head, thank God. He was dubbed the gentleman robber by the local law enforcement because he said please and thank you, and he gave a wallet back. So do I think, or anyone in his family, his immediate support system, which is huge, that he did not deserve to pay his debt to society? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. But to give him life without parole at 21 years old, and then to put him in prison, and not, when I say him and he and my son, I'm not just talking about my son. I'm talking about the thousands that are in there just like him. I have some very close friends. Her son and my son are almost identical, but her son was 18. He's serving life without parole at 18 years old non-fatal, no physical harm. So I love the idea after 20 plus years that there's talk on criminal justice reform, but I don't want my son and all the others like him to fall between the cracks. I love the idea that low-level drug offenders are being considered for leaner, sentences. But I think we have to address what we call and what's considered violent acts. Armed robbery is a violent act. So what I'm saying is, let the punishment fit the crime. It's that simple. Let the punishment fit the crime. If you don't take a life, how in God's name can a prosecutor, a judge, legislators, lawmakers, society, how can we say that it's okay to give somebody life? And also going back to the prison system, he's been in over 20 years. We've seen the good, the bad, and the ugly, all of it. And just when I think we've seen it all, we see more. My son's alive. He's serving a life sentence. So when you're in prison for life, what you don't get the programs, you don't get the classes. He had one computer teacher who was so overworked and over everything. He knew my son wanted in this computer class, wanted in. He couldn't get him in. So this teacher made a cardboard template and gave it to my son. And he said, here, now you can practice, you can learn your keys. So what I'm saying is, he has a life sentence. He can't get into programs. Now, we supply that. We do it on our own. We supply him with things that classes and courses and stuff, but there's very, very little for people with life without parole. So I just want to open up the conversation. Please, don't leave my son and all the other sons and daughters out that committed serious offenses. He committed armed robbery, but like I said again, thank God, nobody was killed, nobody was hurt, nobody was physically harmed. Another mom that I have that I know of, her son was 21, just like mine, and he's serving under Florida's PRR, which is Prisoner Releasee Reoffender Act, for 5 cigarettes. He was charged, this was his second offense, and his name is Jonathan Beaudre, if anybody wants to look him up. He was charged with bringing in 5 cigarettes into the county jail. He's got a life sentence. These things are real, they happen, families are torn apart. My son has a brother, he has a stepfather, he has uncles, he has a huge support system that could get him in a job like that would give him a job and give him training. He has a home to come home to. So anyway, I'm sorry if I went over.
No, first of all, that was very, very well said, and thank you for sharing the story. And I mean, there's so much to unpack there, but a lot of times we... Oh, wow. Thank you for that. I don't know if you guys know the story of Sean Hopwood, but he was on 60 Minutes and everything because he committed armed robbery, several bank robberies up in Nebraska a long time ago. He served 15 years in federal prison, and now he's a law professor at Georgetown University, and he's on FAM's board. He'll be in Tallahassee next week to talk to some legislators about his experience because as his experience shows, and many others like it. Jesse Weiss over at Justice Fellowship, he committed armed robbery, and he's a Neil Volz-style teddy bear. I mean, our statutes codify the idea that redemption is impossible, and especially the PRR statute, I mean, which is just insane and really needs to be looked at. And it sounds really scary. You know, oh, prison releasee reoffender. You go to prison, you get out, you do something really bad, well, we're going to lock you up forever. That statute has really got to be looked at very closely because it yields these kinds of cases, these unintended cases. And a lot of times what our statute does, not only does it codify the idea that redemption is impossible, so often, particularly in the mandatory minimum statutes, it assumes that if the elements of the offense are met, then the person who committed the offense is by definition and then you label them a violent offender, right? It's not a violent offender necessarily, it's a person who committed an offense we define as violent, but just because the elements of an offense are met doesn't mean that the punishment fits the crime, right? Armed robbery is not just, there's not just such a thing as armed robbery. There are all sorts of different kinds of armed robberies committed by all sorts of different people for all sorts of different reasons. And then they can go to prison and have different experiences and grow as human beings and be different people than they were 20 years ago when they committed this offense. Our laws don't recognize those distinctions. If you commit the crime, this is the sentence, that's it. See you later. Your life is over. Insanity, and the result of just this irrational exuberance of punishment back, especially in the 90s, where we just could not punish anyone sufficiently. If it was a misdemeanor, it needed to be a felony. If it was a felony, it needed to be a first-degree felony. If it was a first-degree felony, it needed to be a mandatory minimum. If it was a mandatory minimum, it needs to be a harsher mandatory minimum, and so on. Harsh mandatory minimum, life without parole. And it's an onion, it has to be peeled back, and there's just a lot of layers to it. It's really difficult. I've described it as a brick wall. We just constantly run into it over and over again, but we have to start somewhere. And I would definitely encourage the legislature to take a look at PRR, do a safety valve, something that lets the judge take into consideration the unique circumstances of the offense and the offender to make sure the punishment fits the crime, not only in PRR, but throughout the entire code. Goodness gracious. I went at 2.5 hours without really getting mad. That's a record.
Okay. My name is Connie Burton. I'm from Tampa. And one of the things I want to hold on to is that my vote matters. And moving forward, I would hope that those 1.4 million people in their restoration of rights and those that participated and voted on that, we only see that strengthened and not destroyed in any way. And when we talk about the war on drugs, I think we all know how we got here. You know, I've heard 151 years, 1868, 3. But for me, in the history that I bring to the table as an African woman, is that the punishment has been consistent for 151 years as it relates to my community. And now it has encompassed so many more people, right? So I'm living in public housing and I'm looking at the war on drugs. And I'm looking at, young patrolmen that understand that to get their evaluations, the type of arrests they have to make. And I'm looking at a whole community of young people destroyed, all of them felons. You talk about Sulphur Springs, yes, that is true. They're all felons, missing fathers, all missing in actions, uncles gone. The men's have all virtually disappeared in our communities. And so what it's going to take, in my opinion, people that got political will, because you're not your grandfather and I'm not my grandmother, but we are still living from the effects of that. And so we're going to collect the data that's necessary. But the human capital is so real that it shouldn't take us another 150 years to figure this out. We know it. And so I'm hoping that our political, I'm glad I came tonight, but it's been painful just even being in here. Because you have to take this pain back to your community and then kiss your great-grandchildren and just say, son, try to be better. I'm just hoping that we have enough political will in the state of Florida this time to say, even with this governor, I don't know him, I want to know him. I want to know that he want to do the right thing for the people. I want to have hope and confidence in you all that you can go back and convince your fellow brothers and sisters inside your body to do the right thing. Because we are on a collision course. We almost like the Titanic all over again. We see the iceberg right there. All these damn prisons everywhere. And they're just eating up human consumption when we have the ability to bring our young people back home, allow them to become productive citizens. The only thing I say the fear is that we know we can do it and we won't do it. Thank you.
So let me say something as a FOC, a friend of Connie. Right on. Like, I think the political will is an issue that, matters, and we need to keep pushing. So when I think about people in this room who take the time to get involved, people who come to Tallahassee, it is somebody like yourself who gets educated and knows what it requires to take the steps out of the processes and the history that you were talking about. And I, for one, grateful that you're here, and look forward to continuing to walk with you, Connie, as we implement Amendment 4, as we begin the process of really engaging reentry issues. I appreciate Senator Brandis. He's taken the leadership role in terms of dealing with jobs. We got to deal with housing. We got to deal with access to opportunity. All those things that you outline and that do come back to the real fact that it requires political will to do something. And my hope is that having voices heard that were silenced for a long time, organized in harmony on some of these issues, can be helpful in that process.
Connie, I just want to say one thing to you as the chair of Criminal Justice Committee in the House, where the Amendment 4 question resides. And I've been abundantly clear in the press. I've been abundantly clear in our committee. But I appreciate what you said. There's not going to be an effort to delay or play or thwart with Amendment 4. I think as you watch it play out, understand that passing the amendment is kind of like flipping the light switch. There's some people that think electricity is just going to come on, and it's really easy to make all the intergovernmental things happen. But I want you to know that as the chairman of that committee, I've made it very clear to our entire committee that we're not playing games with it. We're not playing politics with it. We're going to get it right, and we're going to make sure it works, and we're going to keep making sure it works better. The last thing I'll tell you is one of the quintessential things that makes America beautiful is that a single vote and a single dollar are the two most powerful things. Because if I can organize enough of them, as Greg talked about, and Neil and Jeff, if I can organize enough votes, I can change the world. I can change who governs me. I can change what's voted on, what's passed. If I can organize enough dollars in a free enterprise system, I can change the value of what I get. So never forget that the value of the vote is effectively infinite when you can aggregate it, and thank you for being engaged in the process.
Hello, my name is Lance Wissinger. I am a returning citizen. Thank you to everyone that voted on Amendment 4. I recently registered to vote for the first time. So one of the things, there was like 15 different points that I wanted to talk about, but obviously there's not enough time. But one of the things I want to talk about was the gentleman that talked about having the responsibility from the state of Florida, and when does that end? I looked at my time with the state of Florida as an opportunity. I took that time and I tried to do as much as I possibly could. And unfortunately, the time that I was in there, a lot of the programs that were helping people better themselves were being removed. You could sit there and each month there was something new that was being taken away from the opportunities for these guys. So as far as the responsibility of the state of Florida, nobody was forcing these guys to do those programs. But somebody like myself having the opportunity to go through those programs. So what I'm looking for, the hardest thing for me was coming home and dealing with the transition of being in prison. I was in prison for 4.5 years. And so a lot happened between 2006 and 2010. And so I didn't know how to use a smartphone or anything like that. So there was a lot of random things that had happened. But I came home, I had done all these things, and I had this box of really great ideas, but as soon as I hit that gate to come home, it was like I tripped and everything kind of went up in the air and I didn't know how to catch them. And now I've been home since 2011, and now all of these things that I've been working on are finally starting to fall back in place, but it took a really long time. So I'm really looking forward to moving forward, especially with you guys, to have opportunities and to have reentry and to make sure that these guys are coming home. I'm working with multiple different entities right now to try to give people an opportunity that when they come home, they're able to move forward and not go back to the life that they had before. The Bridges program was the work release center that I was at, and we started a Toastmasters program there because nobody had done a job interview before. So I put them through this Toastmasters program, and everybody that went through it, now one of the guys that I was in prison with does TED Talks. So like, we had an opportunity, but we built these opportunities ourselves. So I want to be able to share these things and be able to do these things for other people as they're coming home. So I guess don't really have a question as much as I would like to offer my experiences and my opportunities to anyone that has any questions about how the prison system works from the inside.
Hi, my name is Lorette, and I want to thank you for coming. I spent 8.5 years at Lowell, getting out in March of last year. Now you, if I remember correctly, you said that the mental health department in the state of Florida, $40 million a year. How do you know that the department is actually seeing inmates? Or you just take their word for it?
Well, so we just started spending $40 million a year.
Okay, well.
In July of this year.
Okay.
And the simple truth is the only way we know is, one, they take their word, and two, we visit their facilities.
Okay, well, I have proof in my medical records in my home that they will take one form and claim they saw you 4 times on it. I can prove on dates. I worked in the Pride factory at Lowell. So we have a time clock that we have to clock in and out of. I can prove that I was in that factory and not in a mental health meeting. And I'm just one inmate at Lowell. How many other inmates are they doing this to? And saying that they need more money for their budget when it's not true.
Well, based on some of the information I know of about the wardens that were at Lowell while you were there, I'm not surprised by anything that you're telling me.
Same as, I'm sorry.
I think that's why one of the challenges and one of the opportunities that General Lynch has when he comes into the state of Florida as the new Department of Corrections Secretary is to put leaders in place at these facilities that are going to make sure those types of things never happen again.
Okay, because you talked about hepatitis C. I'm not Hep C positive, but when it became that they had to treat the Hep C patients, I can guarantee you, now all the women at Lowell that were Hep C positive coming into prison, okay, were retested. I'm telling you, at least 70% of those women were now told they were Hep C negative. Yeah, so they don't have to treat them.
Yeah.
This is, and no one verifies anything. Nobody.
No, I completely understand.
Thank you.
This young man behind me is our last question. Thank you, panel.
Gee, thanks a lot.
That's all right, buddy.
First of all, thank you so much for your patience in allowing all of us to speak tonight. I think it's a first for me. I've been to a number of these, and I've never, well, thanks for the experience. My question is short, I think, is that it's directed to Senator and the representative. We've heard tonight the problems and solutions of criminal justice. Have you any idea when you are studying this and finding solutions? Have you any idea of of what amount of money it will cost for each and every solution that you have? And could you give us an idea of what you have reached so far? I mean, the solutions and the cost.
It's an appropriations question, so I think I'm probably the most likely person to answer it. Look, you could give me $500 million a year, and I would say that that's a good number to start with. not to end with, but to start with. And I say that because just the Department of Corrections asked for $330 million this year to keep things the same.
I see.
So they need, a third of $1 billion to just keep their head above water next year.
Have you considered any other source besides state revenues for your solutions?
There's money in 3 areas. There's state, there's local, and there's federal.
Right.
The simple truth is the feds don't have any money, and the locals don't have any more money, unless they raise taxes, and they're not going to do. They want to spend money on education and healthcare there. One of the biggest challenges we have is getting people to actually allocate dollars to the Department of Corrections. It's the easiest place to cut. It's hard to take up $200 million out of education and move it over to prisons.
Why is it easy to cut the corrections?
Well, because who advocates for the inmates? A lot of people have kids in high school or elementary school. A lot of people have healthcare challenges that they're dealing with, right? So you've got young people who have kids and old people who are using a lot of healthcare. Not a lot of people are coming to us and saying, please take money out of healthcare or education and put it in prisons. That's why I think it's incumbent upon us to change sentencing and to focus on diversion and to focus on transition so that we can find savings within the existing system, and instead of allowing those dollars to go into other places, to reallocate those back into the system so that we can make sure that we're focusing those resources on recirculating those dollars back into the system to programs that work.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure.
So I just want to take a minute and say thank you to everybody who was involved in planning this, and certainly to Representative Grant and Senator Brandis and our excellent panelists for taking so much time and really listening, and for all of you for taking time and engaging in these discussions we need to have more of. We need to hear from you. Our website is projectonaccountablejustice.org. We also have a Facebook, projectonaccountablejustice.org, and we also have Twitter at FSU Justice. And I encourage you to reach out to us and continue all the wonderful work you're doing in your communities, and stay hopeful. Thank you so much.
As you folks are leaving, I just wanted to say thank you for staying this long. Seldom have I seen a passion in the audience such as I saw tonight for the issue, and seldom have I seen the passion for change, positive change, in the panel that I saw tonight. I want to thank you, panel, and Deborah. And I would like to call attention, Jonathan, do you have the slides of 2 programs, our next 2 programs that I'd like to let you all know about? 2 weeks from tonight, we're having a program on capitalism and social democracy. You've heard Bernie Sanders talk about it. We're having a program on that. In March, we're having a program on Me Too, a very, very topical program that I know you won't want to miss. Thank you again for coming and for staying to the end. Good night.